In our number 6 spot today, we have the Rajneesh movement. Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh first became known in the 1960s as he traveled through India speaking out against socialism as well as aspects of mainstream religion. While speaking out about these things, he also advocated for a more open attitude when it came to human sexuality, and it's this stance that quickly earned him the nickname the Sex Guru. By the 1980s, he had taken his teachings to the United States, where he opened a facility known as Rajneeshpuram in Wasco County, Oregon, but this quickly upset the locals in the area. Not only were there legal battles surrounding his construction, but there were also crimes being committed by the followers of the Rajneesh movement. And we're talking about really serious crimes. There was a mass food poisoning attack with the Salmonella bacteria, which marked the first known bioterrorism attack in the history of the United States. And if this wasn't bad enough, there was also the attempted assassination of United States Attorney Charles H. Turner. Rajneesh didn't take any responsibility for these crimes and instead blamed his personal secretary and her supporters, but despite this denial, he still found himself deported, after which he returned to India. Here he continued to run the Poon Ashram until his death in 1990. Honestly, the story is absolutely bonkers, the crimes are massive, and the entire thing is just very bizarre. In our number 5 spot today, we have NXIVM. This cult was founded by a man named Keith Rainier, and on the surface level they marketed this group as a multi-level marketing company, but instead it was definitely a cult and a front for disgusting crimes. Keith started off this multi-level marketing career with the company Amway, and by 1990 he had started his own, which ended up getting shut down for being a pyramid scheme. In 1998, NXIVM was founded and was originally called a personal development company and was supposed to help with self-improvement. There was a 12-point mission statement which was recited during the cult classes where they purged themselves of all envy-based habits. There were different modules for classes like relationship sourcing, which helped the members explore ways that they could financially benefit if their partner passed away suddenly, or another class where they only learned about psychopaths and their followers. Eventually, the cult leaders started to branch out and form different organizations related to the cult, and long story long, this cult was not for self-improvement, but was involved in some extremely terrible things. In 2018, Keith was arrested and charged, and in June of 2019, he was convicted for conspiracy and conspiracy to commit forced labor, as well as a few other really awful things, and all of these charges were related to NXIVM. This story really blew up, especially due to the celebrity involvement of actor Allison Mack, who was also arrested for her involvement in the cult. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Manson family. Started by the horrible Charles Manson, this story starts off when Manson was released from prison in 1967, where he then moved to San Francisco, where he gained a small following that would eventually go on to be the cult known as the Family. The group eventually moved to an abandoned ranch outside of Los Angeles, and it was here that Manson continued to brainwash his followers and manipulate them with his own religious philosophies. He is quoted as saying, quote, "I'm God to my friends, I'm the devil to my enemies. When I look to the future, I'm the prophet. When I must lay down the law for our earth, I'm the son of man." Manson claimed that there would be an upcoming race war in which white people would be killed, which was intended to instill fear in his followers. This was so that he could ignite a race war and send his followers on a killing spree, which ended up being the night of the horrible Tate and LaBianca killings. This led to a reign of terror in the Los Angeles area for several months because people just couldn't understand how or why this happened. In our number 3 spot today, we have Heaven's Gate. Started by Marshall Applewhite and his former partner Bonnie Nettles, the two founded the well-known cult Heaven's Gate. These two believed themselves to be something called walk-ins, which they said are higher beings who took control over the bodies of two middle-aged humans so as to spread their word and teach humanity. People who believed their story and were drawn in by the idea of these higher beings were of course being manipulated and taken advantage of, which is all too common in these cult stories and really is the basis for most of these kinds of stories. They gave up their lives and all worldly possessions in the belief that Earth was to be recycled, and the only way to continue surviving would be to leave immediately. The time to leave Earth came in March of 1997 when Marshall claimed that they had a spacecraft that was traveling to the comet Hale-Bopp. The catch with this spacecraft, however, well, Marshall told them that they needed to stage all taking their own lives in order for the UFO to take them to another level of existence above humans. 39 members of this cult, including Marshall himself, took their lives over the course of the next few days. This was the largest event of this kind since the next point we're going to talk about, which brings me to number 2, the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. Jim Jones is certainly one of the most well-known people on this list for all of the wrong reasons. He is the man who claimed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi, and he founded the cult which was originally called Wings of Deliverance, but he later changed the name to the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. After an expose in the New West magazine about the things going on in this cult, he ended up moving the group from the United States to Guyana. From here, there were claims of horrible things and human rights violations, which led to an investigation. People found out that some of the supposed members of this cult were actually being held against their will. In the end, with all of this going on, Jim managed to convince his followers to all take their lives in one massive, horrible event, and this day has gone on to become known as the Jonestown Massacre. A total of 918 people died that day, including Jim. In our number 1 spot today, we have Synanon. What originally started out as a drug rehabilitation program founded by Charles Diedrich in 1958, things quickly changed and this began to turn into a sort of group that shared these truth-telling sessions. At first, it was known as The Game before the 1970s when Synanon was officially born. The founder, Charles, as he began to get some kind of power, he grew greedy and hungry for more. This led to him starting to charge insane fees for his members, as well as forcing the members to do extreme physical labor. This is all bad enough, but it gets worse. Anyone who tried to shut this little community down would be met with an attempted hit on their life. Charles developed a list for anyone who challenged Synanon, and this included a lawyer by the name of Paul Morantz, who actually almost died as a result of the hit that Charles had put on him. In 1991, Synanon finally met its end when it was shut down for tax fraud, destruction of evidence, and Charles passed away just 6 years later.
Number 10. Nightman. Now, the name Nightman sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? If you're part of the Nightmen, you might be a guild that watches over the dark, protecting people like a superhero team, fighters of the day man, master of karate and all that. Well, if only life were that cool. No, you definitely would not want to be a Nightman. A Nightman was a very polite name for a job that boiled down to guy who cleaned human feces out of the cesspit. Yeah. You ever use a septic tank and thought, wow, this is prehistoric technology? Well, imagine a medieval precursor to a septic tank, if you will, and you've got yourself a cesspit. Easily one of the crappiest jobs in human history. Now the name makes it sound like you'd only be doing this for a few hours, right? Were it so easy, humble Nightman. Nightmen would dig for weeks at a time gathering their goods, as they were usually paid by weight, not hours. Consider that, and then consider that any of the lovely amenities you and I have to avoid bacteria, masks, sanitizers, these guys had never even heard of and were shoveling stacks of crap by the literal ton with their hands and faces uncovered, huffing in unimaginable fumes. I imagine that's the kind of work that changes a man on the inside forever. Number 9. Fuller. Perhaps one step down from the humble work of shoveling refuse all day like a nightman is the honest life of a fuller. You see, a fuller's job was to remove the oils from cloth woven from sheepskin and wool. Wool, naturally waterproof thanks to the oils on the sheep's skin, but the underside is very coarse and easily frayed and therefore needed to be dealt with before it could be made into things. Nowadays, we would just use an alkaline solution, call it a day. However, back then, chemistry sets weren't really available, so you'd have to make do with what you had, right? And what better source of natural alkaline than in pee? Specifically old pee, nice and stale. We're looking for that burnt sienna orange. So the fuller takes the woven wool and cloth, soaks it in a nice giant tub full of old pee, and then stomps on it like you're crushing grapes for wine, except it's not at all like you're crushing grapes for wine because you're stomping on wool full of old pee. It was fairly common as well for fullers to source their own alkaline solution, for lack of a better word. There was no royal distributor of old pee. You couldn't stroll up to the pee man, so they'd have to scrounge and collect it themselves, and if that meant heading to public toilets and private homes, knocking on the front door with their hands held open for a big handout, every drop counts. I can't believe I'm getting paid to say this. Number 8. A whipping boy. Have you ever heard the expression whipping boy? To be someone's whipping boy? I know I've certainly heard it a lot, but the history of it is actually pretty fascinating. It was a real position. And basically your whole job as whipping boy was to take the licks for a misbehaving royal. When you have an up and coming noble figure, a prince, a duke, this sort of thing, when they're being taught by their tutors, it would be an unimaginable offense to strike the royal for misbehaving, as their status was leagues above the tutors. But you can't have someone misbehaving without any retribution at all, right? A little negative motivation to push you to work harder and learn harder. That is where a whipping boy comes in. The whipping boy, sometimes a friend of the prince being taught, would be struck in front of the prince in order to motivate him to not commit the same transgressions. It seems a bit of a flawed system because from what I know of medieval European history, it's that kings and princes were rarely remembered for their generosity and and compassion for their employees. Now, bizarrely, whipping boy was actually seen as a fairly desirable position, since it meant you had like an in with the king. Yeah, definitely. I'm sure many young princes saw the guy who was being beaten over the head with a broom and thought, this man is my equal and my confidant and a trusted ally. Number 7, Groom of the Stool. Now this is a fancy sounding job title, Groom of the Stool. Got a bit of an air of quality to it. In truth, it actually was a bit of a respected, lofty position. You had a very close hand to the royal throne. You had a very close hand to the throne. You had your hand pretty much behind the king's bottom at all times. The groom of the stool, to put it gently, was the royal wiper. You see, there's no one bigger or more important than the king, right? The king is like a god amongst common men, and no god should have to debase themselves to something as absolutely humiliating, as dehumanizing as using the bathroom by yourself. So that's where the groom of the stool triumphantly strides in, washcloth in hand. You were kept on retainer whenever the king felt nature's call. You were instructed to fetch the chair and take care of business. And the wipe? That's all you. That's all groom of the stool, baby. That's your moment to shine. And you know, a lot of grooms really got creative with this. They could show off their style, technique, wrist control. There's a lot of artistry to it that I think people realized. The groom of the king did more than just fetching and wiping too. As the man most connected with royal stool, the groom also shared the responsibility of monitoring what was going on down there for any changes in the king's health. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, but much heavier is the hand that wipes the bottom. Number 6, catgut. Okay, in contrast to the last one that had a nice name, this one has a disgusting name, catgut. Way back when in yesteryear, they didn't have the same tools available to us now when crafting musical instruments, so they had to get creative. If you wanted to hear something beautiful on violin, you couldn't just head on down to Long and McQuaid and pick up a pack of strings. You'd need a guy willing to get his hands wrist deep in some catgut. Now, confusingly, no actual cats were involved, but plenty of sheep were. Violin strings were made of sheep's guts, and they would make the strings by twisting strands of sheep's intestines and innards together. Lovely. They'd have to be careful while butchering the animals to make sure they didn't accidentally harm any of the goods. This process would take hours at a time, from the butchering, the careful removal of the organs, and then they needed to be soaked in a wood ash solution to be clean since they were inside a sheep, and then stared at for a few hours to make sure nothing was going wrong, and then the drying process could begin. They say there is nothing more exciting than watching sheep guts dry. And then you can get your twist on, make them into violin. Absolutely disgusting, but when you hear the sweet strings of Ave Maria and you hear how finely tuned those sheep intestines are, you know it's all worth it. Number 5, Sin Eater. This is one of the most metal job titles around. I'm pretty sure the Sin Eater was a boss in Elden Ring, wasn't he? He's in Caelid somewhere. This is definitely one of the more unholy jobs in this list, not as disgusting as gut stringing or crap slinging, but pretty horrid in its own right. Sin Eaters ate sins, and the best way to eat a metaphorical concept of wrongdoing was to eat bread off the corpse of someone who died recently. The idea being that the sins of the man would be transferred onto the bread? I don't know. Anyway, they eat the sins, and the deceased gets to go off to heaven without worrying about their history, could go on peacefully, and the sin eaters make some coin. They were willing to take a risk dooming their mortal soul for a bit of coin. Man's gotta eat. I wonder though, is it worth it? Like, what if you eat too many sins and you don't have any room for dessert? Do sins have an added flavor? I imagine it's got like just a little kick, like a sriracha, like it's a little hot on your tongue. Number 4, lime burner. Now, a lime burner doesn't sound so bad at first. Lime mortar is a common building material, being traced back to the 1st century, but it's not particularly easy to work with. Bear with me while I try to explain the technicals. I'm not as smart as a 1st century engineer, you see. In order to use it, you need to remove the carbon monoxide from the calcium-rich stone, taking the stone and cooking it in a kiln at around a cool 800 degrees. It's not too bad, right? Well, that carbon monoxide has got to go somewhere, mostly in the air. All that carbon monoxide and dust chalk would just float around in the air where you'd be taking big, heavy, deep breaths in. And I'm not sure how much you know about carbon monoxide, but it's consistently the #1 spot on Rolling Stone's magazine list of top 100 substances to not breathe in. On top of this, did you know that superheated lime mortar is violently volatile against water? Meaning that if you were to sweat in a building that was 800 degrees at any given time, it would have disastrous consequences. Be careful. Number 3. Rat catcher. It doesn't sound fancy, but it's exactly what it says in the tin. You catch rats. You gotta wonder why you wouldn't just outsource this to the cat community. They're very good at this sort of thing. Rats, cute as I find them, at the time were filled to bursting with plague, disease, all kinds of grossness. Castle stockrooms were filled with grain, vegetables, and herbs, and if you're a rat, those are the things that make life worthwhile. Rats were a problem for nobility, but an even bigger issue for common folk and peasants, because if these little rats ate up what little grain you had, you would go destitute fast. But oh, come on, who can say no to their little pawsies and their little eyesies? I'm biased, I love rats. I would be a rat catcher if I could. Some rat catchers allegedly were reported to have raised their own supply of rats in order to squeak a few extra dollars out of the town. That's hilarious, by the way, love that scheme. Now traditionally their methods would involve things like leaving out traps or poisoned herbs. That wasn't always enough though, so rat catchers would also invoke the old methods, namely magic, and try to entice rats away with spells. This often didn't work terribly well since rats are naturally resistant to magic, like everybody knows this. Number 2. Plague bearer. The plague ravaged London and Europe, leaving behind a wake of bodies and a stack of corpses as high as your medieval eyes could see. So somebody had to deal with all of that, right? A street sweeper of sorts was needed. You remember in Monty Python and the Holy Grail when Eric Idle is going around ringing his little bell telling everyone to come bring out their dead? Hilarious, right? Well, it's partly based on reality because this is more or less what a plague bearer really was. The parish would hire out plague bearers who would then tour the streets of the village or town or whatever, wagon in hand, collecting the bodies of the ailing and dead to go dump in a mass graveyard shortly after. Tons of fun! They would spend their nights surrounded by dead bodies and their days in the church with the same dead bodies because according to the church's law they were required to live there to prevent spreading what they were dealing with to anyone else. This might be history's first case of social distancing. And finally, at number 1 of the jobs you don't want is executioner. We've all heard of this one, and we're probably conjuring up a pretty vivid image of a burly shirtless monster in a black hood with a big ol' axe or something, wielded by someone who can't get enough of their day job and love their passion of separating necks from heads. In actuality, medieval people weren't that psychotic, and most executioners didn't join the practice out of a love of the game, but were usually coerced into it. Some were butchers who were called to the job, some were criminals who could do the job in exchange for a reduced sentence, but most commonly it was a family business. If your dad was the town executioner, it was very likely you would be next in line to wear the hood. Now the downsides to this job seem immediately obvious. Unless you're super into bloodshed and death, it's probably not the cheeriest job. Seems like the kind of thing you'd take home with you, you know? Kinda hard to lay loose and relax after that. But you know what's worse than the weight of taking another man's life? Social isolation. Executioners were not particularly well liked, looked down upon as outcasts, sometimes even forced to live outside of town. Well, you know what, executioner? It could be worse. You could be the groom of the stool, you could be a nightman, so count your blessings.
Number 10. Plastic surgery. Some celebrities you think are immortal when really it's just their plastic surgery that's fooling you. Unless you're Paul Rudd, he's definitely immortal. Sometimes it's obvious who's had it done, and sometimes it's really obvious who's gotten it done. Coming from the Greek term plastikos, which means to mold or to form, the oldest known plastic surgery took place in ancient Egyptian days. There's a medical text from the ancient Egyptian days that was named after the American Egyptologist who got it in 1862, and in it contains these ancient procedures. They look a little bit different from the shows we see today. You know, where it's like all these medical, we're gonna take this thing and put it into this guy's head. And you're like, how did they do that? This was a lot different. This is ancient procedures we're talking about. What procedure back then was to fix nasal injuries. This method used wooden splints, lint, swabs, and the first ever nose job was done. Even in 2000, a mummy was found with a prosthetic toe. So they asked volunteers to try walking with it to determine if it was created for purpose or for style. That's nice. Here, try on this mummy's toe. Take a lap, see how you feel. Are you cursed? Plastic surgery in the sense of reconstruction, that first account comes from India in the 6th century. The Indian physician Sashruta Shamita is considered the father of plastic surgery. His patients were more interested in the cosmetic side effects, whereas the Egyptian practices were to fix the nose. Now around 500 BC, reconstructive surgery was done in India as well to reform noses that were cut off as a punishment. Number 9. Broken bones. Sometimes a bone breaks and it needs immediate medical attention. Maybe a bone is pushing into a vital organ, maybe it's healing the wrong way, or maybe it's just a toe and you can't do anything about it but hobble around the house all day and learn new curse words as you mumble them and hobble. We all had that one friend in school who always had a cast on, or that blue finger restraint. There's always the one kid. But what happens if you broke your arm in the 1300s? Then what? Well, you wouldn't get any cool signatures from your cool friends, but what would happen is that they would use these blocks of wood and cloth and just wrap everything around completely tight. Just the biggest cast possible. You actually could sign your name on this thing as many times as you wanted. I take that back. This thing was, you pretty much had a coffin around your leg, more or less. Number 8, trepanation. One of history's oldest surgeries, trepanation was the worst, that's for sure. To this day, we're not even sure why this was a thing, but we picked up a few ideas along the way. Turning the clocks back thousands of years, trepanation was the practice of drilling holes into your skull. A popular theory here is that trepanation was done to release evil spirits. Yeah, let's just drill holes into our skull and see if our mental illness just goes away. As barbaric as this sounds, skulls found in Peru hint that this procedure wasn't as fatal as you would think. The reason that this would happen was also to clear out bone fragments after skull fractures. So you'd show up with a headache and then you'd leave with a hole in your head. But honestly, the fact that you're leaving at all is pretty surprising. They obviously didn't have advanced medical instruments. They would use any sharp instruments they could find, like rocks, flint. It was pretty rough. This was the first surgical procedure around 6500 BC. The term trepanation comes from the Greek term trepanon, which means a borer, to drill essentially. Number 7, tooth extraction. You may not think of surgery when you talk about tooth extractions or whatever, but this for sure counts as surgery. Every time something gets removed from your body and there's blood, I'm gonna count that. Sorry. I had to get a tooth pulled a few years ago and I'm still haunted by it. It is so barbaric the way they do it. They don't slice a line and then gently slide the tooth out. No, they had 2 dentists just grab my tooth at the same time, put their foot up, and then just yank my tooth out. We're still there? Really? Back in the day, pulling teeth was done not to make room for braces, but to solve any problem at all regarding your teeth. Cavity? Gone. Toothache? See you later, tooth. Back in 5000 BC, a Sumerian paper referred to dental worms, so the earliest account of tooth decay, we think. Unless they were actual dental worms, in which case gross, but no, you had a cavity. We're lucky to have x-rays and modern technology tell us now if a tooth is coming in sideways, but back then some believed it was always tooth worms, no matter what. If it hurts, it's worms, get them out. Imagine pulling your tooth out and being like, didn't find any worms. Aristotle and Hippocrates wrote about dentistry in 500 BC, and the way that they would handle tooth decay or extraction was by using metal wires to fix wobbly teeth or even a broken jaw, so it was pretty horrible. If you go to the dentist now, just when you sit back and relax, you're sitting back and you're relaxing, that's it. The rest sucks, but these guys would stand up and just get yanked. Number 6, blood transfusion. Back around 70 AD, the Romans were pretty wild when it came to the Colosseum and the games that would go down. There was lots of bloodshed, of course. There's animals and warriors and a lot of stabbies, and crowds would rush the arena after the day was done, not to get autographs, but to hopefully get a sweet sip of that gladiator blood. Yeah, blood was considered a magical elixir back then, and then near the early 1500s, blood was then seen as youth juice. Yeah, if you drink some young blood as an elderly, those knees would just magically come back. Apparently. Don't drink blood if you're watching this. Don't. Unless you're Edward Cullen, don't drink blood. Team Jacob. Lots of theories surrounding blood in the Middle Ages. Bloodletting was a go-to when you were sick, because they thought that your humors were out of balance. It was like, oh, you're sick, you just got some weird blood, we'll drain you out a bit. Vampires, all vampires. In 1628, blood circulation was discovered by a man named William Harvey, and that just absolutely changed the game. Now the idea of something going into your bloodstream was in the picture, hypothetically. So we started to test this out on canines, of course. Scientists were injecting them with different substances, and slowly but surely that turned into blood transfusion between canines. So this is back in the 1660s. That's how early we started injecting things. Number 5. Mummification. Mummification was common. Even today we're finding more mummies. We're uncovering more ancient history. But how the hell was mummification done back then? How was it done so well? We're talking about teeth worms and trepanation. How did ancient Egyptians figure this out? And how is it done in a way where the bodies are still reserved this long? Well, it wasn't cheap, I'll tell you that for free. Being mummified was reserved for the rich. It's pretty brutal, but what you would do is basically you get a hook in your nose and all your brains would be pulled out. And then they would cut the left side of your stomach, remove all those goods, all the organs, just gone, let those dry, yuck. And then you put the heart back in the body and then you wash the insides out with wine and spices over and over again until eventually you cover the body in salt for 70 days, and around day 40 you gotta stuff it with sand. Come day 70, that's when you can wrap them in those mummy bandages. Then the sarcophagus awaits you, and so does the rest of your life. The jars of organs were also stored in the burial chamber with the sarcophagus. So it was just a big room of yuck. Number 4, cataract surgery. My brother was born with a cataract. This one's for you, homie. Cataract surgery is one of the oldest surgeries in the book. Well, rather, in the painting. Found in a tomb in ancient Egypt was a painting of what is surely the oldest recorded eye surgery. Scientists are able to make this conclusion due to the length of the tool that the doctor is holding. A little metal rod going into their eye. Just doing this makes me cringe. They believe this was a method called couching. This happened to be recorded. The needle would push the cloudy lens to the bottom of the eye, ideally fixing their vision. The oldest tools found in Egypt tell us that 4,000 years ago, this was the first time that it had been done. But afterwards, evidence of couching was found all over the world, so they kind of were the OG couchers. It wasn't until 1747 until a doctor in France named Jacques Daviel, he performed the first cataract extraction surgery in a modern sense. Every method, older, ancient, modern, it all sounds wildly uncomfortable. If you've been through this, kudos to you. Hit that like button, glad your eyes and stuff are working. Number 3, transplantation. Blood transfusion is one thing, but how the hell do we figure out transplants? This arm, now over there on that guy? The first successful one was in 1954 in Boston at the Peter Benton Brigham Hospital. That was like a surgical procedure. The first successful one, by any means, came from around 1000 BC. An Indian surgeon, Samhita, had written down details on how to transplant tissue from one of the body areas to repair nose injuries. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. But later on in the 16th century, that idea was revised. In Renaissance Italy in the 16th century, a man named Gasparo Tagliacozzi and finally French surgeon Alexis Carrel changed the medical game again. In 1902, they published their work on the new techniques using new studies on animals and blood vessels, and to this day, that technique is still used. In 1904, they partnered with Charles Guthrie in Chicago and performed the first successful animal transplant, saving the dog's life. So not that long ago, weirdly enough, had to include it. Number 2, open heart surgery. We've discussed ancient Egyptians and how they would clean out the entire body and put the heart back in. Now, of course, they weren't alive during any of this. That body is long gone. But when was the first open heart surgery? When did the impossible become a reality? Well, the first successful open heart surgery went down in Chicago in 1893. The patient was a man named James Cornish. He got a knife wound to the chest during a brawl. Now, the surgeon, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who, by the way, used to be a shoemaker's assistant, saved this man. And the city's first interracial hospital, too. Lots of firsts happening in this one. There we go. There weren't any textbooks on this type of operation at the time, so the odds of survival were low. In fact, there weren't any odds at all at this point. There were no x-rays, antibiotics, anesthesia, but also there was no problem. Apparently, using just a scalpel, Dr. Williams cut through his chest, weaved through the nerves, muscles, ribs, everything important, until eventually he closed a severed artery near the heart. Cornish survived, and come 1894, Williams was promoted to chief surgeon at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Coming at number 1, stitches. I'm going to totally jinx myself after this, but I've never broken a bone or gotten stitches in my life. I'm on a high alert now at all times. 27, not too bad. Many of my friends, though, they've gotten stitches in their life. It's pretty common at this point. So I figured I'd cap this list off by going back to the origins of stitches. Going back to 3000 BC, once again, Egyptian literature, stitches were first made from plants, like hemp or cotton, or even animal tendons or animal arteries. Catgut was the most common. That was thread made of sheep intestines. One of the craziest ways of closing a wound was by using ants, believe it or not. Leafcutter ants or army ants, they would be held against the opening, and then you wait for it to bite down, and once it does so, you would then remove the body, cut the head off, so the head of the ant is still stuck biting onto your cut, staying there until it heals. Imagine Ant-Man showing up to save the day, and he just throws a pocket full of army ants. He's like, I'm here to save you all. He just shows up, whips all the ants. He's like, there you go, you're healed. They're like, we didn't expect this at all. Please send somebody else, Ant-Man. Psh, gross.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory IX was the Bishop of Rome and the ruler of the Papal States from 1227 until his passing in 1241. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that were under direct rule of the Pope from the 8th century all the way to 1870. It turns out that Pope Gregory IX had a very strange hatred for cats. He said that black cats were actually instruments of Satan, which seems a little extreme, but then he actually went as far as to order that they be exterminated throughout Europe, which is definitely a little extreme. With this order, the Pope's followers had to oblige, and there was a drastic reduction in the cat population. But of course, this caused a disturbance to the ecosystem, and the time and the consequence of that became very evident. Because of the decline of cats, there was a sudden increase in the amount of rats, most of which may have been carrying the plague. There are a lot of historians who would argue that this war on cats may have had a huge effect on the severity of the Black Plague. That is of course speculation, as it's pretty difficult to pinpoint who could be at fault for something like that, but it certainly is a very interesting point. This all really does, however, bring me to my next point. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Black Death. I'm sure we've all heard of the Black Death at some point or another. I mean, how could we possibly ever stop talking about something like that? During the 1340s, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that spread rapidly throughout Europe and Asia. It was called the Black Plague because of the fact that this illness would cause people's lymph nodes to become swollen and black. The Black Death was absolutely terrible, and it caused a lot of agony for those who had to go through it. Symptoms included things like severe body aches, fever, vomiting, and eventual death in most cases. There was no cure for the plague, so it just continued to spread. In the end, the Black Death took the lives of hundreds of millions of people. We now all know firsthand what it is like to live through a pandemic, and I certainly wouldn't sign up to do it again anytime soon, so I'm most definitely sure the times of the Black Death were some of the worst times in history. Apparently it is said that if you lived in the 1340s, there was basically a 50-50 chance that you'd survive the Black Death, and then on top of that there's all of the other horrifying ways to die that the medieval times held. All in all, I'm kinda shocked that we're still here today. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Mongol invasion. Being in China during the Mongol invasion certainly was a terrifying time. I'm sure a lot of us here have heard at least some of the stories surrounding Genghis Khan, but if you haven't, let's just say that being on his bad side certainly wasn't a good thing for you. In 1205, when the Mongol invasion in China began, it was the regular citizens of China who paid the ultimate price. What was started by Genghis Khan was carried on by his son and then his grandson, which ultimately led to a 74-year-long campaign that was filled with brutality and destruction. Cities and towns were destroyed, empires were brought down, and millions of completely innocent people lost their lives. It is believed that this invasion took the lives of enough people to cut the population in half from 120 million before to just 60 million after. Anyone living in China at this time would have had to live in absolute fear of being killed for something that you really had nothing to do with. That would be awful and absolutely terrifying. In our number 7 spot today, we have Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI. Pope Formosus was the ruler of the Papal States from October 6th, 891 until he passed away on April 4th, 896. After his passing, Pope Boniface VI took his place as ruler for just a few weeks before he also passed away, which then left Pope Stephen VI as the ruler from then on until his death. After this whirlwind April of 1896, things got even weirder. Before his passing, Pope Formosus had sided with Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto, which was definitely not okay with Pope Stephen VI. So, once Pope Stephen VI gets to the place of being the ruler, he gets the people to exhume the body of Pope Formosus so that he can put him on trial. I feel like this is very gross and very unnecessary, but this really is the type of stuff that went on in the 800s. They propped the body up for trial and had a deacon answer questions for him since he obviously was unable to do that himself. They ended up finding the corpse guilty, which seems a little unfair, and they actually went as far as to strip the body of its sacred vestments, took 3 fingers from the right hand as they were the blessing fingers. They dressed the body in regular people clothes instead of the clothing a pope would be buried in, and then they reburied the body. If this poor man's body hadn't been through enough, it was later re-exhumed again and thrown into the river. If this story wasn't already wild enough, this whole debacle is actually what would later end up getting Pope Stephen imprisoned and then killed. Alright, so I guess the other pope had his justice in the end. I don't know, man. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up nights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people, but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was completely abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances blocked off. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. Just at the tail end of the years of the medieval period, as we transitioned into the Renaissance period, began the Italian Renaissance. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for the development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't always spoken about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that the person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Sometimes people's noses or lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would very sadly pass away from the disease. So basically, what we think of as a really beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing but also very scary and, like, I don't know, kinda close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. In 1087, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that obviously this was because of the wine-only diet. That's actually not true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer? Truthfully, who knows? But I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from his wine-only diet. In our number 3 spot today, we have Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband was killed, and during the time her son was too young to rule just yet. Olga knew that once her son was old enough to be crowned king, her power would be taken away, so she needed to see her wishes carried out before that happened. Her wishes included the capturing and killing of those who took the life of her husband, which was carried out by using scalding hot water. Yeah. Don't even want to imagine what that would have been like. Don't kill the king, I guess. Historically, it really doesn't seem to work out well. Apparently, in doing this, however, Olga developed a bit of a bloodthirst, and she would not rest until everyone associated with the people who killed her husband were all eliminated. It seemed like if you even looked in the wrong direction or breathed in the vicinity of someone who had something to do with the king's slaying, you could kiss your own life goodbye. Olga took hundreds of people out of the tribe that the killers were from. She devised a plan to bury the tribe leaders alive, and she even came up with a plan to set fire to their entire village. It is said that Olga may have locked the tribe's leaders in a bathhouse and burned it down, but we don't know for sure. All we do know is that she definitely was not okay. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a deputy to the ruler of the Mali Empire, but when the ruler went missing while on a sea voyage to find the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, Mansa Musa became the ruler in 1312. During his rule, European nations were really struggling due to civil wars and a lack of resources, but the Mali Empire was flourishing because of their abundance of resources like gold and salt. Under his rule, the empire grew to take up a large portion of West Africa as he conquered 24 cities and their surrounding districts. At this time, Mali was one of the top producers of gold in the entire world, which left Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest historical figures ever. One of the most well-known events events during his rule was the pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey took place from 1324 to 1325 and spanned an estimated 4,000 miles, and it was the first time people outside of the empire saw just how wealthy he was. He traveled with 60,000 of his men, all wearing Persian silk, along with 12,000 slaves who each carried 4 pounds of gold bars, and he also brought heralds who had golden staffs, along with a bunch of camels and horses. This pilgrimage had a profound effect on Egypt as this huge group of people passed through. From the markets in Cairo to the royals to the impoverished people that crossed their path, Musa left Cairo littered with so much gold that it depreciated the value of the metal in Egypt, and it took decades for them to recover. In our number 1 spot today, we have St. Marcellus's flood. This was actually a very serious extratropical cyclone that swept through around January 16th, 1362. This cyclone eerily matched up with the new moon, and it spanned through the British Isles, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. Here's the thing, this storm not only lined up with the moon, but also peaked on the feast day of St. Marcellus, which is the reason it got its name, but usually people refer to this one as the second, because there is another. The first St. Marcellus flood took the lives of 36,000 people as it swept through the northern Netherlands in 1219. The second flood, however, while no one is sure the exact numbers, it is estimated that at least 250,000 people lost their lives. While there have been plenty of devastating floods in history, this one is said to be blamed on Atlantic gales, and that this event goes hand in hand with the Great Wind of 1362.
Cut Cult is number 10, and they quite literally cut themselves out of a different cult, Summit Lighthouse, their origin. In 1975, founder Elizabeth Blair Prophet pitched herself and her husband as messengers of ascended masters who were believed to be spiritually awakened ancient beings. Because of branching off of one cult wasn't apparently enough, this couple tossed in some other cult elements from Christian Science, the I Am movement, and general doomsday cults. Mix that together and shake, and you've got a married couple siphoning money out of growing congregation members to buy land in Montana, which was to be their apocalyptic safe haven. Members worked themselves to the bone and drove themselves into debt, clamoring to reserve a spot in the safe haven and build their fallout shelters. This cult held their flock from leaving by stranding them in this haven, now bankrupt and with nowhere else to go. They used tactics like sleep deprivation and manipulation against any who tried to depart. The prophet retired, not died, just retired one day in 1999 and passed in 2009. Since, the church is still run, but with endless legal issues and succession debates. Builders of Aditum is number 9, and it's a super chill group if you can get behind mystic rituals, magic, prophecies, and clairvoyancy. Paul Foster Case, a Catholic Freemason, founded this group in 1922. He combed the teachings of Esoteric with tarot cards, Masonic imagery, and the Kabbalah. Quite a power combo. Anyways, Case saw himself as not divinity, but a man sent to, quote, accept the enormous responsibility of founding an order dedicated to the welfare of all of mankind. And that's kind of what he's done. This group has had a following of 5,000 members worldwide, excluding those followers who don't pay the membership dues. Like Jesus, who many believed was trained in the Kabbalah, members of BOTA aspired to build the inner temple, to construct the Holy of Holies within. People of all faiths are welcome to study the teachings of this order. There has been some rumors that BOTA won't allow any LGBTA members to advance in their spiritual journey past a certain level, as they are considered unbalanced, but with exception to that, this cult is pretty tame. No money laundering, no frauds, no harming of its followers. It's devoted to the study of mystic rituals, magic, religion, tarot, and ancient spirituality. It wants to sell you a lot of books and lessons, but that's about as dark as it gets. They even have known physicists, authors, and astrologers as part of their group. After the passing of Paul Foster Case, Ann Davis took over the leadership, but she's not as favored as the past Paul. Overall, they're said to have a slow and comfortable process and explanation of their information and practices. You can check out their website as well. Cults go Hollywood with number 8 in the countdown, the Aetherius Society. Known for its residency on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles, this bizarre group starts in the 1950s with leader Dr. George King, who one day says to have received a cosmic transmission from the Interplanetary Parliament that explained that Aetherius, an alien from Venus, was our next messiah. King also believed himself to have spoken with many entities he saw as godlike cosmic beings or masters. Jesus is also one of those, and also from Venus, BTW, and the Lord Buddha is another. Naturally, like many cults, Aetherius has predicted the apocalypse. However, the Aetherians of the past and present aren't doommongers like many other apocalyptic cults. While they know it's coming, they weren't told when. The Aetherians are also quite existential, practicing self-awareness and meditation, and are acutely aware of global climate issues and politics that affect the currents of our society and our planet. At the center of this serious society is a belief that around the world there are 19 holy mountains, each individually imbued with cosmic significance by George King. Mount Baldy in California is the object of their frequent pilgrimages. With energy they create from their prayers, stored in a crystalline battery and transmitted via radio signal, they endeavor to maintain global peace. You can check out this tranquil but bizarre cult on their website or their Facebook page. Classic rom-com or just comedic? Number 7 is Full Circle Cult. Why the glib comment? Well, this cult is founded and run by Andrew Keegan, best known for his role as Joey in 10 Things I Hate About You. So how did he go from acting to culting? In 2014, Keegan started his new spiritual movement aimed at spiritual millennials in hip and upbeat Venice, California. And Keegan's cult advertised itself as advanced spiritualism, or the highest spiritualism founded on universal knowledge. They also enjoy ayahuasca. This cult offers workshops and community meet and greets that allow for public interaction. Every week, a diverse group of congregants will take part in yoga, cultural gatherings, and ceremonies inside the 110-year-old temple at 305 Rose Avenue, one of the oldest buildings in Venice, California. It's also been used as a temple for multiple religions before this cult, which was probably part of the renter's appeal for Keegan. A year into running, Keegan faced fines for the distribution and sales of alcohol without a license when undercover ABC agents confiscated several containers of kombucha that were apparently brewed a little too strongly. This group has also been known to enjoy a little bit of the Mary Jane on the side too. While we don't know if there's any sinister intent in this group, we do know that it has struggled. Due to big companies like Google and Snapchat moving into the area, rent got too high for the group by 2017 and they're forced to leave their temple. Keegan promises though that the cult isn't over and rather a new level is coming, including sound healing, education, medical type practices, food, and health. This name changer of a cult is number 6. It's the Moonies. Founded by Sungyoung Moon in 1940s Korea, this cult is now called the Unification Church and has had many other names. While born in North Korea, he was eventually imprisoned there under a false accusation from the government, and when released, Moon fled to South Korea. Before this had occurred, Moon had already been preaching and had his first vision of Jesus appearing to him with the task to establish God's kingdom on earth. With his newfound prison freedom, Moon started his church in South Korea, a mix of Confucian and Christian beliefs mixed with divine prophecies. With that, Moon created the new Bible. Unlike many other cults, this one got big, sitting at around 10,000 members in its prime. When Moon held the infamous mass weddings, they required stadiums for the thousands of attendees. A rejecter of romantic love, weddings were the holy marriage blessing ceremony, a core ritual at which couples are removed from the lineage of sinful humanity and engrafted into God's sinless lineage. In the 70s, the Moonies made their way to the US, where they reportedly separated college students from their families through brainwashing. They've also been accused of deceptive recruiting methods, practices, and manipulative financial frauds. This cult has faced lawsuits, government scrutiny, and even had 400 of its members abducted in the 70s and 80s for cult deprogramming. Moon died in 2012 and the religion broke off into 3 factions, each following a family member. Some follow his widow, who many consider to be a messiah and is now the founder of the Women's Federation for World Peace International. Others followed his eldest son to his Family Peace Association, and others followed his youngest son to the Sanctuary Church. I guess cult leader can be genetic. Here we go again with the Brethren at number 5. If you watch part 1 of our bizarre cults, you may think I'm revisiting the same cult. Don't worry, I'm not lazy, it's just that cult leaders aren't creative with their names. This Brethren cult was founded by the late Jim Roberts, a preacher's son. He had practiced sermon by 15 and later served in the Marines. This combination of strict religion and disciplinary Marine Corps made for a hardened man with some unique ideology. In Chicago, his religious philosophy paired with leadership skills, charisma, and an air of authority allowed him to gain a small group of congregants by visiting college campuses and public areas. He had about 100 followers under a tight knit hold. At the time, he ordered everybody to drop out of society nomad style in 1971. He had explained the decision in order to secure a place in heaven, people had to begin purifying themselves, according to the passages of the Bible. Brethren must forsake their families and friends and all material goods. You sew your own clothing and you eat from the dumpster. And of course, all money goes to the leader. Laughing and dancing are a huge no-no, as are children playing and anyone accessing medicine or medical care. Naturally, the cult has been accused of negligence for allowing its members to suffer or even die from perfectly curable illnesses. The only acceptable transport to them is bikes, buses, and hitchhiking to get around. Men wear their hair short and have long beards, and women wear long tunic dresses. Women, of course, are subservient to men, and everyone was subservient to Roberts while he was still alive. In 2015 that changed, as Robert passed from cancer left undiagnosed from his hatred of medicine. But most converts didn't change anything and remained nomadic. Many are still out there. Thanks to the coordinated efforts by parents of cult followers who created the Roberts Group Parent Network, several members have managed to be deprogrammed and returned home. Ikanakar, a fun word that I'm probably pronouncing wrong, is number 4. Ikanakar and all its frivolousness was made possible by founder Paul Twitchell in 1965. It's a New Age religion group, and like many other New Age religion groups, it was really just code for a jumble of mysticism and Eastern philosophy mixed with yoga, meditation, tarot cards, and made-up iconography. Believing all members have ancient roots going back 10,000 years, they were to be given a new name and learn the secretive language of the Ekanars. All of it done in the name of the group's meditation ritual where one chants, "Ha!" and separates their soul from their body. Dreams are regarded as important teaching tools, and members often keep journals to facilitate studies. Ekanar teaches that spiritual liberation in one's lifetime is available to all, that it is possible to achieve self-realization. This group started in Minnesota, Canada, and it's now spread throughout the country, and it's made its way to others such as Europe and Asia. But it's primarily practiced here in North America. Since Twitchell's passing, this group has had several successors and remains popular today. Despite being a registered nonprofit, the group sells its founders materials for a hefty profit, and there are allegations that virtually all of the books are plagiarized. Come on, you know by now cults love fraud. Happy Science could have you looking sad in number 3. Far-right nationalism meets New Age spiritualism in the Japanese Happy Science cult. Founded by Ryuhei Okawa in 1986, he had been a cult member himself in the Godlight Association. Okawa decides to dip and start his own cult of personality when he realized that being a cult leader could prove to be a lot more profitable than being an anonymous corporate employee and a cult follower. Okawa pitches in his sermons that he is a human incarnation of a supreme being called El Cantare, who combines Christ and Buddha and Muhammad and every other prophetic deity to create a 9-dimensional heaven with him at the head, and of course can communicate with the celestial. He predicts that some of these celestials might visit us one day bearing the apocalypse. He's also convinced that there's a space alliance that forbids any kind of interstellar attacks or war between planets. Apparently some representatives could already be here, living among us, so remember that the next time you start trash talking the aliens. Here's where the strangeness picks up a notch. He also created a massively complex mythology of New Age nonsense while simultaneously founding an extremist political wing called the Happiness Realization Party. His party advocates the vicious Japanese nationalism devoted to denying historical cruelties, advocating for conflict with China and North Korea, and to rebuild Japan's infrastructure. The group claims to have 12 million members around the world, has multimedia arm, and enjoys a tax-exempt status in the USA as a church. Let's get biblical. Number 2, the 12 tribes. So sorry for how cringy that was. The 12 tribes take holistic and traditional practices to exploit under the guise of New Age hippiedom. The Christian fundamentalist cult was born in 1970s, led by Albert Eugene Spriggs and his wife Marcia in Tennessee. They advertise their nature communes and 70s themed diners and cafes, whilst behind closed doors, their practices are far less than free love. There is a belief that slavery was a marvelous opportunity for black people, and the support of conversion camps for the LGBTA who they think the world should be rid of. The 12 Tribes tries to keep its extremist teachings from outsiders and even some of their inside members, but former members and experts on fringe religious movements who have helped followers escape paint a pretty horrific picture of life in the group. Black and LGBTA members especially suffer, as once indoctrination is over, members change tune and become aggressive towards them. Their followers sacrifice their earthly possessions to live in any of the many communes and follow the teachings of the modern-day apostle with no deviation, lest they risk being ostracized by the cult and damned to an apocalyptic lake of fire. Members must work for free in the commune stores and cafes. Their access to internet, secular books, movies, everything, worldly influences of any kind are extremely restricted. In its 50 years running, 12 Tribes distinguish itself from other tribes with legal businesses, operations such as food services, construction, soap making, woodworking, farming, solar energy, and even an Alaskan fishing operation. By members living communally, sharing money and resources, and all businesses staffed by followers who work without pay, ex-members told the Denver Post this is how the cult perfectly constructed to leave you with nothing should you choose to leave. This next cult is one of unbelievable brutality. It's the Narcosanticos at number 1. Okay, so that's a word and a half, but it essentially means the satanic doobie dealers led by Adolfo de Jesus Costanzo. Its members were traffickers and deeply disturbed people. Having studied Palo Mayombe from a young age, Adolfo took fascination with the concept of remains having religious purposes and affiliations. This fascination grew, and while Palo isn't inherently evil and can be used for great good, Adolfo was also exposed to his mother's criminal behavior and criminal consorts as a child, as well as rampant poverty, which were huge influences on his future life of crime. I'm going to keep this vague because the victims deserve to be acknowledged more than the crime. After moving back to Mexico as a teen, Adolfo made a group of friends who indulged his radical and bizarre opinions about the benefits of animal and even human sacrifice in the name of deities. They began to run a profitable business casting spells to bring good luck using Adolfo's Palo background and some made-up mojo, involving expensive ritual sacrifices of chickens, goats, snakes, zebras, and lion cubs. Many gangs and high-ranking politicians visited the group on their ranch property for these spells. It's here the group indulged in the use of heavy substances, and the religious factor was metamorphosized into dark magic intensely. Believing the magic he took from Paolo Mayombe may be the success of their cartel and the spell business, Adolfo realized that if the dead bones in his Nganga altar worked this well, how well would live ones? Tragically, this realization resulted in the sacrifice of over 20 people, which most had incredibly inhumane ends. The cycle breaks, however, with Mark Kilroy, an American who had been abducted and sadly perished by the group's hand. American authorities put pressure on Mexico and forced their police to find out that a cult leader had been under their noses all along. Adolfo refused to go to prison and went down in a literal blaze of glory, never facing punishments for his crime. 14 other members were arrested and charged, and American authorities still wait for the release of 3 of these members from life sentences in Mexico for their turn to be prosecuted in the USA. Number 10 is suspicious hygiene. Well, at least it was suspicious to others, but to the Scandinavians and their Vikings, it was actually incredibly common and important. They had a weekly regimen for their cleaning their bodies or the cleaning of their clothes. This is where the unsettling part does come in though. See, in traditional Nordic beliefs, it is suggested that since you never knew the day of your death, you should always look your best for the inevitable arrival in the afterlife. This is because when you die, you will be in the presence of your gods and any soul that has departed before you. So, by dressing and grooming yourself daily in a clean manner, you ensure that you would not have to be ashamed. And it also had cosmic significance in maintaining order and staving off the cataclysm of Ragnarok, which would end the world. So to break that down, they were hygienic because however they died is how they would meet their gods, looking like that, and also it would help prevent an apocalypse. Okay, so the Viking reputation for being well groomed comes from Christian accounts condemning such behavior as vain and posturing, which seduced Christians into emulating their evil pagan ways, and doing so angered the Christian god. In reality, chroniclers were just pissed that the Vikings were kicking their asses and stealing their women. A famous example of this resentment towards Viking superiority and, well, hygiene is after some Vikings did a sacking of a monastery in 793, scholar Alcuin wrote multiple letters to English kings denouncing those Christians who had begun dressing and caring for themselves as the pagan Vikings did, since this obviously incurred God's wrath. What you give is whatever you get with number 9, blot sacrifices. The concept of this ritual is an exchange. By sacrificing to the gods with certain items or certain requests, the Vikings could receive something in return. Sometimes it would be a request for fertility or goodwill regarding the weather or the harvest. Sometimes it was luck in battle. It's believed that there are 4 of these blots that were done during the year at the time of the autumn and spring equinox and the summer and winter solstices. One of the few documented blots in history is documented by Icelander named Snorri in the early 1200s, who described how all the farmers of the area had gathered at the temple to make sacrifice, and a meal was provided by Sigurd Hakansson, a generous man of wealth. Multiple animals were sacrificed, primarily horses, and the blood was collected all in bowls, being that the participants used twigs to splatter the blood along the stone altars, walls, and the participants themselves. Then they cooked the meat via boiling in cauldrons and blessed it by a god's priest, and then some was eaten by all in attendance. Beer was also blessed, then consumed with it. They would make a toast to Odin and decree to the king and victory before emptying cups for Njord and Frey to secure a prosperous and peaceful future. After all was done, they made final toasts to their kin who had now been resting in burial mounds. Number 8 is worshipping whites. So Nordic history is sadly lost because of how Christianity colonized the country. When they invaded, they didn't just erase history, they actually buried it. So cultural hubs and temples were made of wood, and they were torn down and burned on the spot. Then, on their exact foundations, new wooden churches were built. Those were later torn down or fell from natural elements, and new stone churches were built on those foundations. When those crumbled, they buried history even further beneath the foundation. During this Christianization, the missionaries were more focused on suppressing the belief of named gods like Thor, Odin, Frigga, you get the idea. But smaller collectives of deities got to continue on without awareness of Christian authorities for a little. This is why we have some paper documentation of the worship of whites. Whites were protective deities on areas of land, and there were many religious rules for how to deal with them to avoid conflicts. It's debated what whites are fully. Some say they are undead ghosts, ghosts or they're nature spirits. What's agreed upon is their claim as land protectors. They are tied to the landscape, often to a certain rock or a mountain or even a valley itself. When Egil Skallagrimsson was driven from Norway to exile in Iceland, he decided to piss off some rights in revenge. He erected a knitting pole on white land to frighten and enrage them, bringing all of Norway bad luck. It's said Iceland is protected by 4 of these wights, and they have taken the form of a bull, eagle, dragon, and giant that will kill or decimate any invaders attempting to approach. They are depicted on Iceland's coat of arms. Piss or get off the pot is number 7. Like the ancient Greeks, the Vikings also had a portable and creative fire that they equipped towards enemies. Unlike Greek fire, which still remains unexplained, we figured this one out, and I'm sure you can guess what it is from the title. I have no idea what they were doing or trying to accomplish, but when Vikings boiled a bunch of urine with a piece of tree bark fungus called touchwood together for days on end, that fungus could then be pounded flat into a strip of like felt material. Then these pieces of material could be ignited and literally tossed around. Again, no idea how they came across this combination or why they were boiling it in the first place. All we know is that this is what they figured out. Anyways, these urine saturated strips were flammable due to the sodium nitrate in urine. Paired with the spores in the mold, they created a smolder effect instead of an inferno. So they were quite convenient for setting campfires or portable fuel for cooking rigs. Either way, the Vikings carried piss grenades, and I think that's pretty wild. Number 6 makes me cringe. It's tooth modification. As aforementioned, Vikings cared a lot about their appearances, bleaching hair, combing beards, herbs in the armpits, ironing clothes with rocks, and apparently modifying their teeth. What do I mean by modification? Well, prepare to flinch like crazy because archaeologists have found multiple Viking skulls where there are intentional shape changes to teeth or grooves, dots, and other patterns carved into them. It's primarily been the top front teeth, and researchers believe that the grooves were filled with dyes like reds and purples. Due to the Christianization I previously described, there are no records explaining this practice, and it's unknown to us until we even discovered these skulls with modifications. There is some assumption that maybe it was earned or associated with a level of status, perhaps even used by warriors to incite fear in their opposition. What we do know is this practice was not seen anywhere else in the Caucasus and European regions at that time, and further information just remains lost. Gather around the Yule log for number 5. Yule itself. That fun little YouTube video a lot of people put on their TV whilst opening presents Christmas morning is actually its own holiday. Yule is a period between winter solstice and the blot ritual done for that solstice. It's speculated to be somewhere around January 12th each year. The reason it's celebrated, once again, is lost to history, but speculation is that it honors the dead, the new year, and to celebrate Thor and the coming sunlight he brought as days become longer. We know that there's a multi-day feast and alcohol paired with singing and games. Vikings would make a sun wheel that they would set on fire and roll down a hill in honor of the sun's return. Sounding like a party to me. Naturally, they made Yule logs decorated with yews, hollies, and firs alongside carved runes. A piece of this Yule was kept every year until the next Yule to protect the family and be the start of the first fire of next year. Yule is actually the basis for most Christmas traditions. The Yule log, decorating a Christmas tree, ornaments, caroling, making cookies, so much more. This is actually because when Christianity was forcing its way in, they needed to up conversion, but no one was interested in monotheism. So they created Christmas, and they used the Yule traditions as a basis in order to convince people to convert. They also took St. Nicholas and the concept of stockings, which were boots originally, from Eastern Europe and the Balkan region to convert them. Clever Christians used people's pre-existing cultures under a new name to have them join them for a lot of different things. What they didn't take, however, was the unsettling detail that every 9th year of Yule, it was customary for Swedish kings to sacrifice men at the temple of Uppsala. 9 heads would be offered to the gods, with the bodies hanging out of the temple's sacred grove. This would go on for 9 days, totaling 81 sacrifices that would be accompanied by feasts and Yule festivities. Number 4 is Zombie Avoidance 101. A suspicious amount of cultures speak of the undead creatures rising at night to torment the living that can't enter a door without being invited. It makes you wonder what they saw that we didn't. Called Draugr, Scans and Vikings lived on the assumption once any corpse was buried, it would become animated again. If it were peaceful, then it was called a hogboy, and it would innocently reside in its grave to protect it from robbers. However, when they weren't peaceful, they were Draugr, wandering away from its burrow to harm any human it could find. Precautions to avoid this included pieces of straw placed in cross formations under the burial shroud, a pair of open scissors placed across the chest, the big toes tied together, and even nails poked into the bottom of feet to make walking out impossible. Even how the coffin bearers would stop before leaving with the coffin, raising it 3 times in different directions, would symbolize a cross. Since Vikings Vikings believed the dead could only return the same way that they came, it was believed that the deceased wouldn't be able to enter a house without invitation, and a body carried out feet first wouldn't properly see the route back from its burial mound. Once the deceased was out those doors, any jars, saucepans, cauldrons, chairs, clothes, anything used by the deceased that others would later be using was turned upside down. Number 3 is the baby trials, and yeah, I literally mean a baby going through trials. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not the Olympics, the baby didn't have to like throw a spear or man a Viking ship, but they did have to be accepted and acknowledged as a real person. Norse didn't consider babies as humans the second they're born. This may seem strange to us now, but that mentality likely spared immeasurable grief as natural mortality was so high. By having emotional distance, parents were able to protect themselves, an important perspective to remember. With a happy, healthy, and alive baby, the Norse went through a few rituals to humanize it. First, the baby was sat on the ground until the father picked up the child and placed him inside his coat or cloak. This symbolized the father accepted that the baby was his child. Next, they inspected the child to ensure it was healthy. Blindness or deafness wasn't attested, by the way. After those two acceptances, the ceremony of Asavatni occurred and they sprinkled fresh water on the baby. The last step was Nafnesti, a naming ritual. The father would state the child's name and bestow a gift, usually things like a ring, farmland, weapon, or even deer. This final acceptance made the baby officially a person, and any offense towards it would be penalized as if the baby was an adult. Number 2 is all kinds of ghastly, the blood eagle. The TV show Vikings brought this torture method to widespread attention. You've likely also seen it in TV show NBC Hannibal or the horror movie Midsommar, a Scandinavian-based film. It's a method of execution that could last hours and sometimes days, and it was rumored to have killed King Aleia in 867 AD. The punished was laid face down, restrained with his arms and legs spread, and an eagle was carved into the skin of his back before the skin was peeled back and ribs separated from the spinal cord with an axe. But we aren't done yet. The ribs and muscles are then pulled outwards to represent the wings of an eagle, and of course, salt was then pressed and rubbed into the wound. While the victim is still alive, his lungs are gently lifted out of the body to rest on the stretched out rib bones. As the victim died, his last breaths and the wind amongst him would make the lungs flutter like that of a bird's wing. Jesus, I don't even know how to follow that up with a witty comment, man. I think I'm gonna just move on to the next segment. So number 1 is somehow more grotesque. It's the berserkers. We all know Vikings were absolute beasts in battle, so you had to know this list was gonna get a little darker towards the end. They had this thing called battle fury, which in recent times we have theorized to be the result of either intentional or accidental use of psychedelic and fungus. This could cause a self-induced hypnotic trance, resulting in them losing their sense of pain and conscious control of their movements. But nothing was more terrifying than a berserker. They took that battle fury and multiplied it by 100. They took on the appearance and behavior of either a bear or a wolf, even donning the pelt or the heads of their chosen animal. Oftentimes, that's the only garb they wore at all. Apparently, to reach this status, they lived out in the wild like their totem animal. Being stripped of humanity allowed them to take on the strength and mindset of that creature. So when they fought in battle, berserkers apparently used just their bare hands and teeth. And according to legend, they felt no pain and could keep fighting for hours despite any injury. They were said to have even ripped man limb from limb. Imagine going into battle in like 600 AD with an opposing army you've never seen before, and then it turns out it's a bunch of 6'11" dudes in animal skins out of their minds on psychedelics and carrying 7-foot swords. Yeah.
Number 10. St. George's Church. Kicking off our spooky list, we're gonna head to the Czech Republic. St. George's Church was originally built way back in 1352. That's a long time ago. And it's seen many dark days, of course. The building itself was destroyed many times by fires, century after century, yet it somehow survived all of them. One of the worst timed events ever happened in 1968, and this is what makes people think it's haunted. More than fair. The roof partially collapsed during a funeral service, and after that point, everyone was convinced that the church was haunted, and they refused to enter and do any more services inside. More than fair. That's the worst timing ever. I'm thinking of, I Think You Should Leave Season 2, Coffin Drop. I'm thinking of that sketch right now. That's gonna be in my head all day. The location is still a hotspot. Since 2012, many visitors entered the cursed church. Would you go in? Would you do it? I would, probably. I'd poke my hand in a little, see what happens. I'm terrified of ghosts. I wouldn't go near that. Number 9, Edinburgh Castle. Scotland's capital city. I've been to Scotland a handful of times. It's one of my favorite places to visit. All those pubs, ooh, what a good time. Wish I could remember. It's got a castle, I've heard. You got a castle over there. Apparently, Edinburgh Castle, I of course have to visit every time I go. It's a calf workout that I look forward to, personally. Now, some of these parts in the castle are chilling, because it's, it's freezing cold in Scotland, but sometimes you can feel the haunt in the air. These rooms date back to more than 900 years ago, so these walls have seen a few fortnights. Sightings are pretty popular. Sightings of a colonial prisoner from the American Revolutionary War, that's pretty common, so that's terrifying to hear. And as well as French prisoners from the 7 Years' War. You're just gonna see ghosts of prisoners that might pop up or photobomb you. That's really, I'm terrified talking about this. If you're thinking about visiting, perhaps the ghost of the wandering dog in the castle cemetery will convince you to buy a ticket. I love Scotland, it's beautiful. The air just smells nice. Got a big old hill too. Number 8, Almadam. Almadam is about 40 miles southeast of Dubai. This ghost village was built back in the 1970s and it was deserted shortly after. It's beautiful, but legend has it the land is full of shape-shifting spirits, you may have heard of them, called jinns. Now these spirits are responsible for scaring folks away from the town. Yeah, that ought to do it. Now it's tough to tell whether the spirits have since departed. I mean, that would be ideal, but Almadam still looks haunted and it still is abandoned, so yeah, my vote is probably still haunted. Dunes that partially swallow rows of houses and a mosque, it all just sits there stuck in history. Now these spirits are still living in the 70s, so who knows? This is their home, not ours, so let's just leave this one alone. It looks like something out of Tim Burton's Beetlejuice, you know what I mean? All the sand, just barren. It's haunting, so jarring to look at. Or that one level from Mario Odyssey that's just, sand and nothing else. Number 7, Gunnever, Iceland. This one has heavy history behind it, holy smokes. Now sometimes places are haunted by multiple ghosts, past prisoners, while others have, just one up story. Iceland's Gunnever mud pool, perhaps you visited, it sounds kind of, nice when I say it out loud. It's one of the largest and haunted. Apparently, the pool was named after Gunna, a woman who lived in this area of the peninsula 400 years ago. Sadly, Gunna passed away of starvation, but her spirit apparently came back home and killed the current landlord and his wife. It was terrifying. That's a big yikes. The town called in a priest to take care of that issue, but of course, some visitors today claim to see that same ghost of one Gunna around the very same boiling hot mud pool. One Gunna sounds like a rapper, I don't know why I said that. Ghost or no ghost, I'm not going anywhere. This sounds like an expensive hazard to be near. Anything boiling or muddy, I'm like, no, that's a hazard, that's hot. Number 6, RMS Queen Mary. Heading over to the beautiful Long Beach, California. Here we go. I'll tell you right now, I would never spend a night in this hotel. Nope, I would rather sleep in Stephen King's 1408 hotel room than this RMS Queen Mary situation. During World War II, the ship was in operation briefly, and then it served as a luxury ocean liner from 1936 to 1967. Now during this time, a killing happened, a sailor was also crushed by a door, very tragic, and a couple people had drowned in the pool. So it's a lot of bad stuff going on here. It's like the back of a DVD of Ghost Ship. You're like, what am I reading? This is terrifying. Cut to 1967, Long Beach purchased that ship and turned it into a hotel, a flotel, dare I say, where now it still sits today. Would you visit here? Would you spend the night in this haunted Titanic? Let alone, I wouldn't even step a foot on the boat, no way. Boats scare me in general, let alone ghosts on a boat. Number 5, haunted ballroom. This one I would for sure check out. I would definitely moonwalk in a haunted ballroom. Are you kidding me? This is like the first 8 minutes of that Thriller music video. This house, if you want to call it that, this mansion slash castle, was built between 1871 and 1887 for New Zealand politician William Larnach. And like every other Disney castle, you need to have a 3,000 square foot ballroom. Yeah, no friends required, just here's the big ballroom, good luck. Larnach gave his 21-year-old daughter a ballroom for her birthday. Yeah, here you go, Kate, now go make thousands of friends. Good luck. Would you want a ballroom, like as a gift? That feels like the worst gift ever. What happened to ponies, Dad? Jeez. Kate sadly passed away at age 26 due to typhoid cancer, but death does not get in the way for Kate. No, the spirit of the youngin' is still said to haunt the ballroom and still dance around. So, beautiful on one hand, so terrifying on the other. A haunted ballroom ghost? That's the scariest movie I can imagine. Number 4, the Snedeker House. This is a classic Ed and Lorraine Warren ghost story. They have a few out there, probably too many, but we'll see. It was the main inspiration, believe it or not, to The Haunting in Connecticut. We've seen that movie. It's a classic. It's a good banger right there. Ed and Lorraine got a call from the owners in real life of the home saying that their son was experiencing personality changes. Now at first, maybe you'd laugh at that call. Maybe he's just growing up. Maybe he's a bit moody, whatever. Now this was not the case at all. He wasn't just a moody teen growing up, shut up, Dad. That wasn't that here. These changes were violent in nature, and on top of that, a pretty obvious other issue, they were seeing apparitions in their home. Sun's acting odd, and we also have ghosts, so Ed and Lorraine were of course interested. Why not? Old house in Southington, Connecticut. Alan and Carmen Snedeker then found these tools, old tools used by morticians in their house. Yeah, their home was once a funeral parlor. Fun fact to find out after you've moved in, I guess. That's the worst thing to find out. One day when Carmen was mopping the floor, it apparently turned blood red and began to smell foul. So Ed and Lorraine came to one conclusion, and that was demons. The house was full of them. Yeah, that ought to do it. You start mopping, all of a sudden there's blood everywhere. You're like, well, that's it. That's your home now. Enjoy. Let it dry, and then, yeah, pine sols in the cupboard. Brick legs. Number 3. 455A Sackett Street. Not to be confused with 221B Baker Street, that's where Sherlock Holmes lives. 455A Sackett Street is a haunted apartment in Brooklyn. Yeah, it's not very majestic, not a lot of eyeglasses. Imagine moving to the big city, a big city that's known for being loud, and on top of that, now you have ghosts. Good luck getting a wink of sleep. One lady who grew up in the apartment experienced these hauntings herself. Apparently fires would start randomly, loud bangs would happen in other rooms, all around just bad energy, which given what I just said seems more than fair. Sightings of apparitions were common, but it was always the same female looking spirit. Number 2, cursed stadium. Can a sports team be cursed? I mean, I live in Toronto, home of the Maple Leafs, so our last win was like 1743, I believe. I don't know. But the Chicago Cubs curse, maybe you've heard of this. That was a huge deal for a very long time. The Chicago Cubs curse comes from 1945, when a man named Bill Sionis, nicknamed Billy Goat, great nickname, he was kicked out of a Chicago Cubs game. He actually didn't even get into the game 4 to begin with. Was he too intoxicated, or did he bring a live goat with him to the game? Yep, the latter. That's why he got kicked out. Bill brought with him his pet goat for good luck. So, after the staff said, of course, no, you can't enter the 1945 World Series with a live goat, get out, he then cursed the club over and over on his way out, saying the Cubs ain't gonna win no more. And that was the game that they dropped the ball, pun intended. The Detroit Tigers won, and the curse of the Billy Goat then kicked off for real. It got so out of hand that come 1994, that long later, the Cubs had lost 12 games in a row, their worst home start in history. So Sam Sionis went to Wrigley Field, everybody was chanting to, finally let the goat in, and then the Cubs won 5-2. So, I don't know. It's kind of proven that there was a little bit of a curse here. Number 1, the Borley Rectory. This house was originally built back in 1862. It was a house built for the rector of Borley, but after a fire in 1939, it was of course never the same. It was finally demolished after 1944, but before its final days, the Daily Mirror printed a lot of history about this house, just working for BuzzFeed back in the 40s. Harry Price, a paranormal researcher at the time, reported sightings of a ghost nun or a ghost car that would often drive by. Both probably so distracting for your day-to-day duties. As well as footsteps and unexplained sounds on the property, it was all deemed haunted. A little piece of the haunted home still sits in the Warren Occult Museum today. It's a brick, a nice haunted brick from the Borley Rectory. The rectory, the Borley, just a haunted brick. Hey, come on up to, line on up around the block to see this haunted brick. Yeah, not bad, right? Check out that ghost brick.
So, in at number 10, we have witch marking. I'm trying to avoid some things we've already covered in similar videos, so while we've discussed witches, let's talk about witch marks. So during the English and Scottish witch hunt days, there was a belief that witches always had a natural skin mark. This could be a mole, or a scar, or a pock mark, or even a really bad zit. So when they came across a woman whom they thought were a witch, but she didn't have any of those markers, that was the end of it, right? She isn't a witch? Well, no, they gave her a skin mark instead, specifically by using a pricking needle which the witch hunters would carry. These needles repeatedly pricked the flesh of the accused until it produced the result that wouldn't bleed but was insensitive to pain, which fulfilled the criteria of a witch's mark. It's a subtle punishment for something that they were yet to be accused of, because by giving them the mark, they could now accuse them. These witch hunt days were a whole mess. Number 9 is marking your territory. Not in a cool, sexy, I got a tattoo way, more more in a Scarlet Letter kind of way. As you'll learn in this video, a woman who cheated or even was single and just engaged in intercourse of her own free will could be classified as a sinful adulterer and cheater and be punished, usually a lot worse than a man. So when Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter, he took inspiration from real life events. The letter, which for the character Hester Prynne was just a red A, was usually the letters AD, which stands for adultery, as outlined by the Plymouth Colony Law in 1658. Multiple accounts across Europe verify that someone who was being marked was to be seen out in public without it, could be subject to public whipping and other public humiliations that ensured a person's social alienation. Like in The Scarlet Letter, when Puritan minister Arthur refuses to admit his sinful side of the act with Hester, he's branded with an A in his chest. In a man's case, while this was of course painful, it was allowed to be hidden. He also didn't have to face the societal consequences the way any woman would have. For number 8, we travel to discuss status degradation. While it still persists today, not everyone knows what it means. So essentially, you do something wrong, oopsies, you lose some of your basic human rights. You could steal something, have relations out of wedlock, cheat on your partner, miss some work. Every empire that has used this tactic has had a variety of ways that you could mess up and receive this punishment. Naturally, in times where a woman was property and couldn't buy things, own things, or do things, or breathe without having a man side-eye her for it, this was a monumental punishment to receive. Under the Roman Empire Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noblewomen in the Kingdom of Korea during the Chosun dynasty faced a similar degradation of their societal status if they were found guilty of remarrying as a widow. This intentionally made it hard for Korean women to remarry, as they would have nothing to offer a new husband, no inherited lands or funds, and a societal belief deemed her as used goods. Even the descendants of widows at the time who had remarried faced status degradation. They were barred from ever holding office. Adulteresses in the Chosun were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born statuses. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Chosun dynasty faced an even graver punishment, which was death. So why take someone's status from them as a criminal punishment? Well, because aside from the fact as a woman you'd essentially be left jobless, homeless, and without any family, it's because of a cheater's fama. Number 7. While fama is a Latin term for reputation and good name, every country had its own version of this fama. And if you cheated, or were even just accused of cheating in 13th century France, which by the way happened a lot because husbands just want to get rid of their wives, the woman was always the center of the punishment, even if that was the man who had been cheating. This is because the status is all a woman ever had for a very long time, and the name of her family's reputation laid on her shoulders. Thus, all that pressure to be religious, virtuous, and most importantly, a submissive woman. The customary laws of Agan province list public humiliation for both the wife and her lover as the appropriate punishment for adultery. If the man could escape before or even after arrest, he could get off without any punishment, and his partner had to face her punishment alone. The woman got no such reprieve, even if she was just the mistress he cheated on his own wife with. In fact, if she tried to escape arrest, it warranted a death sentence. Women whose fama suffered through public shaming, walk of atonement, were no longer deemed honorable members of society, and seeing as standing of individuals before law at the time was often based on their reputations, what others thought of them, and how they behaved in public, she'd be left, as I said, homeless, familyless, and dejected. For my Game of Thrones people, think Cersei. Number 6 is no protection. Get your mind out of the gutter. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, there's no protection from capital punishment. While civil laws were easier to work around by just getting married alone, you can borrow money or property, you can buy things that you couldn't before and sign contracts, the criminal law didn't bend to a married woman, as she faced the same penalties as an unmarried one. Now, there are technically one exception: pregnancy, but only because it could potentially be a boy, which is insane. Additionally, all women were exempt from certain torts, such as the breaking wheel. But man, when a woman got capital punishment, it was the one and only form, and it was the most brutal and painful one: burning at the stake. By the way, they claim this was the only and the necessary option of execution for a woman, as it's a preservation of female modesty. Apparently, other forms of execution were unbecoming of a woman. Although there may be some truth to this wild justification, modern historians have rounded it down to just misogyny, as well as a deep-rooted suspicion and dislike of women as the root of this execution decision. Essentially, when given the opportunity to punish a woman, men went ham for it and wanted to see her suffer as much as possible. So women experienced the worst executions of the Dark Ages. Number 5 is why women want to stay in religious favor. In medieval Europe, a device was literally invented for women who defied their religious beliefs. Pyramid-shaped and made of wood, the woman who dared to defy her god should fear this. See, they would bind the woman's hands and ankles and then sit one of her two openings on the peak of the pyramid. She would then be incapable of shifting her weight anywhere else and was forced to put her weight down on the tip. It would slowly slide upwards and inwards, and the longer she was pressed down on it, the more her body split apart. These women would be left for days on end sometimes on this device. The device's slow, agonizing death can be compared only to the shame it inflicted as well. The woman was stripped nude and forced to suffer this torture in public for all to see. Number 4 is harems. To start, the word harem is derived from the Arabic word harim, and it often means sacred, forbidden, and sometimes sanctuary. This was an accurate name as only women's household members and some related male members were allowed to enter a harem, which was an honored women's space. The harem was the ultimate symbol of a sultan's power. His ownership of women, mostly slaves, was a sign of wealth, power, and sexual prowess. The seclusion from public gaze also inflated this power more so. But a royal harem could be a place of filth and stink where chaos and emotions ran high. This was the price of being property. Used by the emperors and his sons, you could either be favored or so hated that one day you vanish and rumors of your exile whirl amongst your peers. These ladies usually did not have the liberty to move out of the harem as they liked, but inside the harem they could move around as they pleased. There was no sisterhood in them either. Socializing amongst themselves was usually not friendly, and jealousies were shown directly. Makes sense, as status and position of authority in the harem were determined by the place that they had in the emperor's favor, and to give the king his first male child was a great competition in this regard, resulted in unpleasantness through the royal harem. Everyone tried their best to please the emperor and turned her bad qualities like jealousy, aggression, or short-tempered attitude onto other women. Seeing as many of these women were stolen from outside the empire, let alone inside, frustration with language barrier and culture clash was also a huge source of contempt. Sometimes the women would lie to the sultan to have others disposed of, or they'd simply gang up on one another. Regardless, harems were places of drama, inequality, and a race to be favored as a ticket out of sexual servitude. Hidden sexuality is number 3. There were plenty of mainstream laws in medieval and Middle Europe against male homosexuality, and while it wasn't considered as serious, lesbianism still posed a threat to the ideals of a male-centric societal order. A law written in 1260 France stated that women caught engaging in homosexuality shall undergo mutilation on her first and second offense, and on her third she must be burned. This is one of the only laws to specify consequences for lesbianism, but the 13th century and Christian perspective of sex radicalized further into modesty. Lesbianism was equated to sodomy at that time point and therefore carried a similar sentence: death. There is sufficient evidence of lesbians in Middle Ages, most of which come from the church. Turns out many nuns were sexually active lesbians, and the church directly acknowledges their presence by having to pass laws establishing penalties for nuns caught having sexual relations with each other. So not only were they having sexual relations with each other, but it was enough that the church had to do something about it. For example, during the 8th century, Pope Gregory III gave penances of 160 days for unnatural female acts. Still, no torture or death though. This is because as long as phallus or other phallus-shaped objects weren't used or involved, the relationship wasn't considered real intercourse. Real intercourse involved procreation after all. So eventually, when Christianity upped the ante, however, any sexual act that caused pleasure, which now included lesbian intercourse or plain old self-stimulation, was now considered sin. So like most women of the Middle Ages, even bisexual and lesbian women had to settle down for a man at that point. Anyone who struggled with sexuality can imagine how dreadful it would be to live that way. Divorce was a nightmare, which is why it's number 2 in our countdown. Laws worldwide were unforgiving of divorces, literally always to the woman. In Chinese laws, a woman could only divorce her husband if he mistreated her family, not even her. He, on the other hand, could divorce her for anything. Some accepted grounds for divorce were failure to bear a son, evidence of being unfaithful, lack piety to the husband's parents, theft, suffering a virulent or infectious disease, jealousy, and talking too much. Pretty superficial list, but in Chinese society, divorce was a serious action with social repercussions for both parties, so consequently divorces were not as common as they may sound. She could not be divorced if she had no family to return to, or if she had gone through the 3-year mourning period for her husband's dead parents. And speaking of family, during the Han Dynasty, unmarried women brought a special tax on their family, and women with babies were given a 3-year exemption from the tax, and their husbands a 1 year. So there was a huge push to get married. Meanwhile, in medieval England, their similarities are stark. They too had a small number of divorces despite an expansive list of reasons to do so, such as there was a discovered blood relation between the individuals, or impotence, or fear used to obtain consent, marriages entered into under false pretenses, things like that. In many of these cases, the lack of sufficient evidence made them difficult to prove and thus deterred people from taking their cases to court. And number 1 is the tradition of foot binding. It existed for around 10 centuries, and there are women alive today who still have feet that are the result of feet binding. Foot binding involves systematically breaking the feet and shaping them inwards. This tradition started in the 5 Dynasties 10 states period of the 10th century, when beloved concubine of the emperor built a gilded lotus flower stage and performed a dance on bound hoof-shaped feet. Being a beloved concubine, the other concubines of the emperor attempted to imitate her feet to curry his favor. So, foot binding began within the royal court and spread through China as the next fashion fad. It's done in a ritualistic ceremony accompanied by a variety of traditions to ward off any bad luck. They began by tucking the toes under the feet and using a long, tight ribbon wrapped up to the ankle to hold it all in place. Anytime the foot grew, they broke it inwards more, a process usually taking 2 to 3 years. The foot would remain bound for the rest of a woman's life. There is a whole list of issues this caused. Outside of extreme agony and being a handicap, it caused some women pain for the rest of their life. Their walk was changed, as was their posture, and the idealism of a slim body to lighten the pressure on one's feet was all the rage. The binding of feet actually caused the women to develop strong muscles in their hips, thighs, and buttocks, so much that the characteristics were considered physically attractive to Chinese men of the area, aka the girlies were thick. When colonization came to China, Western women boycotted foot binding, going as far as to catch women with bound feet and cut off their bindings. A humiliation because these women would never ever show their bare feet to anyone, let alone even husbands. And many of these women lost their husbands when the Western boycott worked. A lot of girls who had had their feet bound in order to become marriageable suddenly found themselves abandoned by their husbands because foot binding was no longer fashionable at all.
And we're kicking off this list with blot. These were blood sacrifices that were performed in order to appease the gods. Luckily, blot often refers to sacrifices of animals rather than human beings. It was often horses or pigs that were used, but the size of the animal was in direct correlation with the level of gratitude they were showing towards the gods. The animals were placed over stone altars before being sacrificed, and their blood was collected in a bowl that would get passed around, and with each person they would, take a sip of the bowl. Sometimes twigs were even dipped into the bowls of blood and then shaken around at onlookers, spraying them with droplets of blood, kind of like a Jackson Pollock painting is what I picture. The meat of the animal was also doused in its own blood before being feasted on. This was a really common practice. It would take place all throughout the year, but now let's move on to a more special Viking tradition. Next up, we have Viking Yule. The Viking Yule festival sounds pretty pleasant. Some of our modern Christmas traditions were inspired by Yule. They'd feast, burn the Yule log, there was a Yule tree, again very Christmas reminiscent. They drank heavily, sounds like Christmas to me. There was one tradition though that's thankfully been left out of our modern holiday celebrations: human sacrifice. Yes, every 9th year during Yule, there would be a total of 81 human sacrifices spanning over 9 days. So that's 9 human sacrifices a day. Yes, kings would sacrifice 9 men per day, with their heads being offered to the gods. What a way to ring in the holiday season. Happy Yule, Sven. By the way, cancel all your plans because the king just told me you're getting your head cut off this afternoon. This isn't even, really all that strange. Human sacrifice has been present all throughout human history, all over the world, really. And it's just kind of funny thinking about how celebratory it was here. Not something that's easy for us modern people to wrap our heads around. The various methods Vikings would use to ward off the Draugr. First off, what is a Draugr? They're basically undead warriors. Zombie Vikings. Yeah, zombies. Scary enough as it is. Imagine facing off against an undead Viking. They were depicted having superhuman strength, they smelt of death and had a ghastly appearance. They would also often be, depicted as blue or like dark, with decay. If you've ever seen The Northmen, you may be familiar with the Draugr. We get this this awesome fight with one of them. Very cool creatures in Viking folklore. So Vikings, being as superstitious as they were, sought to prevent the recently deceased from becoming one of these undead entities, and there were several methods they would employ. They would sometimes place a pair of scissors on the chest of the corpse, they'd hide twigs in their clothing, or they would drive needles into the bottom of their feet to keep the dead from walking around again. That one makes sense. That's a pretty practical one. They would abandon children deemed sickly or weak. This isn't much of a surprise given that Viking culture was so heavily centered on strength. Vikings were a warrior culture, constantly engaged in battle, so children that were too small or sick were just really of no use. The most common method of ridding themselves of the weak was to just chuck them into the sea or take them deep into the forest where they'd be left to fend for themselves, often freezing to death or becoming a wolf pack's next meal. They didn't just do this in order to maintain a strong society though. Vikings also lived in a very harsh climate where, those that were unable to contribute were just really extra mouths to feed. They were a bit of a burden. So yeah, different times. This is also a practice not unique to Vikings though. Another famous group of warriors, the Spartans, dispose of unhealthy children. So yeah, I'm glad we live in 2023. Vikings actually dyed their hair. Yes, as it turns out, that classic image a lot of us have of Vikings in our minds is having long blonde hair and beards. It's not just a myth. I guess, nobody ever thought the blonde hair thing was a myth necessarily. Many Nordic people have blonde hair, of course, but that super extra blonde look really was a thing. The beauty standards in Viking culture called for blonde hair. So for those that didn't have it naturally or just wanted to get it extra blonde, they would have, they would actually use a specific type of soap that was heavily concentrated and contained high amounts of lye, which we still use today to make stuff like glass cleaner and fertilizer, actually. This would basically strip their hair of its natural color. They were basically kind of like bleaching their hair, really. They'd also do the same things to their beards, which, oh my god, I can only imagine how dried out that would have made them. Beards, you gotta moisturize these things, the hair is very different. I bleached my hair before and it gets super stiff. It's almost like hay at first, so they must have had some extra crispy beards. Speaking of cosmetics though, let's talk about Vikings' teeth for a moment. Having nice teeth, it's a sign of attractiveness, good health, but these ancient warriors would modify their teeth for reasons that aren't 100% confirmed, but we can speculate that it was to make them appear more fierce, because I don't think Vikings were all too concerned with pretty, other than their gorgeous blonde locks. Skeletal remains of ancient Norsemen had been dug up in Sweden and parts of Denmark with horizontal grooves kind of carved and cut into the front of their teeth. For the most part, they were just horizontal lines, but there had been other shapes found as well. Again, it's not 100% known why some of them did this, but it's said that maybe they dyed the grooves to create kind of cool lines on their teeth, almost like tattoos. It would have been extremely painful, as you can probably imagine. Nobody likes going to the dentist. And it wasn't super common, but it was definitely a bit of an ancient Swedish trend. There are plenty of cultures all around the world that would also do something similar to this, but Vikings are the only known culture in medieval Europe to have practiced it. Next on the list we have swords and weapons. There are several traditions held at Viking weddings that are rather familiar. The bride and groom would exchange rings, they would celebrate with a feast, there would be animal sacrifices, all pretty standard, but unsurprisingly, swords also played a major role in Viking weddings, because of course they did. First of all, the groom's buddies would hide a sword in the grave of one of their ancestors, which the groom would then have to find and retrieve, kind of like a sword scavenger hunt. Pretty fun. If I ever got married, I might want to incorporate that somehow. And then when it came to the actual wedding ceremony, the bride and groom would exchange rings, yawn, but they would also exchange swords. These swords would have been passed down through their family, and the exchange of the blades symbolized the union of the two families that were now there to protect one another. It's actually quite a lovely idea, really. The Viking funeral. We've all seen this one in movies and shows before. It's that classic ritual where a warrior or king is sent out on his ship and burned at sea. There's a common misconception that this is pretty much how all Viking funerals took place, but this was really more reserved for higher ranking members of society, as ships were expensive and, you know, kind of important to people who would like raid villages and travel around the world. But the first step was to prepare the body of the deceased. It would be washed, dressed in its best clothes, and adorned with jewelry and other belongings. It was then placed on a wooden boat. The boat was filled with the deceased's possessions, weapons, food, sometimes even livestock, or even a sacrificed slave. Family members would often place personal items and offerings in the boat as well. Once everything was set though, the body was taken to the funeral site. The boat was then set ablaze either by a torch or a flaming arrow, and then the flames of course would consume the boat and the possessions of the deceased, releasing the soul of the departed to the afterlife. The Vikings believed the higher the flames, the better the chances of the deceased's successful journey into the afterlife. So family members would often add oil or other flammable liquids to the fire to ensure a bigger, brighter blaze. And why not? I mean, if I'm gonna go, I want to go out as as big a fire as possible. Go out with a blaze of glory. The Blood Eagle. All right, this one is pretty gruesome, so fair warning. It seems as though Vikings could get pretty creative with their methods of torture. The Blood Eagle was a nasty practice in which the unlucky recipient is restrained, lying face down on the ground. Then the image of an eagle with its wings spread out was carved into the victim's back. Already sounds awful, but nowhere near finished. Typically using an axe, each of the victim's ribs were then separated from their spine and kind of like splayed out. So in the end, they'd have almost this appearance of wings coming out of their back. Pretty creative, hence the name. Hold on though, still not done. Sometimes, if they were feeling extra feisty, you'd even rub salt into the wound at this point by literally rubbing salt into the open wound. And just to top it all off, the lungs were then pulled out and splayed over the exposed ribs, which would then kind of flutter in the wind like a bird's wings. Vikings would often perform this horrific ritual on their worst enemies or even members of their own society who had been deemed dishonorable. So yeah, living in the Viking Age would have been even more brutal than you may have thought. It's not 100% known, once again, if this ever actually happened or if it was more of a tall tale, but I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised it was really a thing. People can be pretty messed up even nowadays, so you can only imagine what people were up to back then. And coming in at first place is the practice of awaking one's berserker power. Berserkers are not just a thing of myth. These barbaric warriors were really said to have existed, and the method of becoming a berserker was pretty brutal. They would undergo a process of kind of death and rebirth, stripping themselves of their humanity to live in the wilderness as the animal they represented. There are kind of three types of berserkers that are kind of known to have existed. There are wolf kind of ones, bear ones, some kind of took on the appearance of a boar. They would hunt like animals, raid villages with a ruthless animalistic fury. For their battles, they would enter into this almost trance-like state after performing dances and howling and roaring at the sky. They often fought completely naked too, which would also be, imagine just an army of big naked men roaring like animals rushing in from the forest to raid your village. Berserkers just evoke such awesome imagery, and it's no wonder they're some of the most iconic warriors in history.
Slander is number 10. Imagine seeing some random dude in the market square holding his nose and shouting about how he was a liar. Honestly, wasn't weird under the Norman law from 1066 to 1154. If you committed the act of slander, on top of paying damages to those whose reputation you may have affected, you also had to do the holding of the nose. This law was enacted by Pouty, first king of Norman, who had spent his whole life on the throne being called William the Bastard for his parents' unmarried status. In return, he exacted this silly law that required the slanderer to stand in the center of town, as previously described, holding their nose and shouting about their lies. Public humiliation has long since been an effective means of preventing crime, and just about anything. Number 9 9 is Jenny Craiging it. Edward III of England was so tired of his royal court and nobility being heavier set that he made an entire law about it. In 1336, the new law stated obesity made people not able to aid themselves nor their liege lord in times of need. Edward mandated a maximum belt size and also, if you watched part 1, implemented food restrictions, banning more than 2 courses with the exception of holy days. Edward even defined soup as a separate course to prevent people from calling that a sauce or a condiment. This law lasted remarkably until 1856. Its main purpose in the long run had likely become beneficial economically to ensure that England's resources could be employed more effectively in the upcoming war with the French. Still, regardless, he seems like a fat-shaming dude. German purity law is number 8. Beer is Germany's national drink, and that's nothing new. The Germans have been indulging for thousands of years. Typically, beer was produced in groups and always made of pure grain, until the purity laws made by Wilhelm IV in 1516 Bavaria. Germans, and most people of the medieval and Middle Ages, didn't drink water as it was often deeply contaminated. They drank beer. The law imposed was aimed at preventing crops used to make bread from being squandered on brewing, so it stipulates that only water, barley, and hops were allowed to be used as key ingredients for beer production. At first, brewers thought this was ludicrous and unusual to decide, but turns out Wilhelm was actually onto something with this combination. This original law went on to become the core of German beer purity laws that affect German brewing to this day, which makes them the oldest regulations related to food and drink in the world. The only change to it in recent history was the adding of yeast. The Brewers Association of Germany wants the 5-century-old law governing how German beer is made to become part of the UNESCO World Heritage List. It would join the Argentinian tango, Iranian carpet weaving, and French gastronomy, among other famous traditions that are considered unique and worth protecting. Let's talk sumptuary laws with the Spanish garment laws, number 7 in the countdown. Sumptuary laws, which we discussed in part 1, are placed in to control the nobility and their consumption and displays of material goods. In the case of Spain, there are many sumptuary laws in place as early as the Spartan era. In the 13th century, for example, Siena passed a provision reducing the trains on women's dresses, which was a direct effort to curb a purely aristocratic style. In 1356, the city of Florence proclaimed it illegal for women to have buttons on their clothing without a corresponding buttonhole. And also, no one other than the king was legally permitted to wear a scarlet rain cape. Also in Florence, it was studied how sumptuary legislation around fashion served as a tool to encourage marriage in a society where excessive extravagance of men providing clothing for the women and their families exasperated the custom of very expensive dowries. If her standards were already up, you had to work harder to pay for her, I guess, and a delay in marriage did mean a dip in population. While there are ample examples of the laws themselves, similar to many other sumptuary laws, there's virtually no record of their enforcements or punishments. Oftentimes this is because nobility themselves violated their own laws that they made for themselves. Without evidence of how exactly these laws were enforced or whether they were enforced at all, it remains extremely difficult to discuss their social impact, the attitude civilians had towards them as well. Did they act accordingly so as not to face legal difficulties or the payment of fines? Who knows? Not us. So on to the next. Refusing knighthood comes in at number 6. This law was put into place in 1233. Why, you may ask? Because simply put, being a knight sucked. If you saw our last video, you may remember hearing about how insanely taxed knights were, but on top of that you had to pay for a ton of mandatory clothes, train incessantly, pay the king for serving him, and don't forget the custom-sized armor. You lose or gain weight, you're gonna have to pay to replace whole pieces. That's on top of the potential of dying in a battle you just don't care for. No, not many people wanted to be a knight. Roger of Dudley refused to attend his own knighting when he learned he'd have to pay for it. In response to his refusal, Henry III on the spot passed a law against refusing the knighthood. He forcefully knighted Dudley and also confiscated his land to boot. Yikes. Number 5 is the legal protection of claiming sanctuary. Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame depicts an iconic scene of Quasimodo swinging around on rope dramatically over the burning base of the Notre. Having just saved Esmeralda from an execution, he holds her aloft in the cathedral's terrace and screams out sanctuary. Sanctuary actually predates Christianity and originates far back into the 300s and existed until the 16th century. Every medieval law folded to the protections of sanctuary no matter the criminal's crime. Now, sanctuary-seeking criminals might have been required to perform penance or go into exile, but they were at least guaranteed immunity from punishment. That's right, you could literally strangle someone and then run to the church to claim sanctuary, and no one could come in and harm, arrest, or remove you for punishment. Sanctuary was abolished due to the new tide of judicial law and the arguments of crime, power, and punishment. Also because people should be punished for, I don't know, maybe taking someone else's life. Originally, before Christianity, it was temples such as the ones in Greek and Rome offering the solace, and it was part of the Roman law by the end of the 4th century to have it. Christianity adopted this practice to try and persuade people to join their religion when it started. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, churches maintained their authority to protect people who had broken major secular laws. Number 4, let's meet the Yellow Ladies. Venice, Italy was an important trading post. Many people came and went, many travelers came to see the great city, but for those who had been at sea for a while, they may have wanted to see a little something else. As a result, medieval Venice was a massive red light district, enjoyed by many before their next voyages. Trying to control the number of ladies working the streets, the Venetian government mandated in 1360 that brothels must be concentrated in the market and port districts. Obviously, that just made their industry boom more since it was concentrated right where all the money came in and not dispersed, requiring men to travel farther out in convenient ways. Angry now that they weren't at least getting to capitalize off the potential tax revenue of these women, they in 1420 decided to be accommodative of their Lady of the Night friends. The Venetian government accommodated more red light districts and implemented safety means within them, as well as the law of yellow. All women of the trade were to wear shades of yellow so as to be identifiable to their clientele, so random ladies just out on a stroll who happen to be in the area don't get harassed. But also it's a little bit of that classic shame tactic of making someone unwanted easily identifiable for discrimination. Number 3 is the indigenous sumptuaries of Spain. As early as 1501, the crown warned natives who carried sword, dagger, or any other weapons that they faced confiscation and may be condemned to more punishments according to what the court sees fit. Spanish restrictions against natives developed through the 16th century. This mandate is no surprise as these items, while dangerous, complemented and enhanced men's fashions, and fashionable repairs became integral to everyday masculine attire in Europe. To the indigenous, they had been items of necessity to carry and often seen as symbolic. For indigenous men of the elite, the right to bear arms highlighted much more than their privileged status the way that it did for the colonizer. It demonstrated colonial acknowledgement of their once dominant standing on their original lands and partially vindicated their marginalized reality even as a royal. June 8, 1685, Don Diego Garcia, an indigenous leader of what's now Guerrero, had petitioned to the Viceroy of New Spain to intervene on his behalf when this sumptuary denied him the right his parents, grandparents, and ancestors had always possessed. Garcia was one of 505 petitions submitted by 277 towns between 1575 and 1693 demanding change. In response to a perceived disregard for the law, the monarchy reissued the restrictions 6 more times over the course of the next 70 years. The items requested by Don Diego Garcia reflected both indigenous and European definitions of masculinity. By focusing on European attire and the personal weapons, Garcia took advantage of the social currency imposed by Spanish colonizers. As an elite, Garcia faced decreased political power and increased marginalization under a new regime. Garments and swords provided the ability to visually assert himself in everyday life. Ultimately, petitions submitted by Garcia and his peers reflected not just a request for special status items, but an attempt to assert their belonging as an elite man in a colonial life. Number 2 is just absurd, but you can club a Swede if they cross the frozen sea between Denmark and Sweden. What? This unusual law was imposed during the Dano-Swedish Wars of 1657 to 58. King Charles Gustav of Sweden had been planning to cross the Öresund by ship, but the freezing temperatures of January changed that plan. Frozen solid, the Swedes realized that they could simply just walk across. This completely caught the Danes off guard as no attack had been predicted until the spring, and they scrambled to compensate. Ultimately, the Danes signed the Treaty of Roskilde and yielded to the territory dispute. But ever since that day, should you see a Swede crossing over the frozen sea on foot, you are legally free to swing a big old club at him. And finally, at number 1, you either tuck it or you lose it. Medieval Wales was not playing around when it came to women being violated. If you were caught or perpetrator of this heinous crime, your options were to pay a dowry or gets the little man chopped off. That's right, a violation such as this was actually considered a theft and was treated as such by the law. Should a perp pay the dowry, then legally the woman's virginity or body was restored in legal parameters. Can't or won't pay the fine? Well then, that was the end of down there for you. The reason for this, other than it being morally right, is that the fines and punishments hope to stop families from developing harmful feuds which would damage the wider society as a whole. This was not exclusive to Wales, however. This punishment shows up in the 1750s Code of Constantinian Marvodakat in Eastern Europe. It was not unheard of for women to also simply just take the law into their hands either. In a rural area of Shropshire near the Welsh border in 1405, Isabella Grorinus and her 2 daughters ambushed her, attacked her in a field, tied him up, and did the dreaded snip snip, and stole his horses to boot. All 3 women were subsequently pardoned. Alright, so you guys know my drill, so let's start off with the information most people may know a little bit more about already, such as dowries, which is a nice way for fathers to say, I will literally pay your family to get this chick out of my house. The arrangement of marriage was done by the bride and groom's parents. Royal or noblemen were sometimes able to choose their bride, but marriage back then was not based on love for the nobility. They were political arrangements. Husbands and wives were generally strangers until they first met, and if love was ever involved, it came after the couple had been married. But even if it didn't, most just sort of settled into a form of friendship or companionship, or just living with each other. The arrangement of marriage was based on monetary worth. Noble girls equal fatter stacks. Meanwhile, peasant dowries didn't really happen often, and when they did, they were paid in utilitarian means. The family of a girl who was to be married would give a dowry to the family of the boy she was to marry. After the marriage was arranged, the wedding notice was posted up on the doors of the church, and the notice was put up to ensure that there were no grounds for prohibiting the marriage by stating who was to be married and if anyone knew any reasons why they could not. But more on that in a little bit. Now, as mentioned, peasants were able to marry for love, but why make that choice? There was no marital benefits back then, because it's marriage or burn in damnation. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church essentially presented women with 2 life options in order to escape the sin of Eve. You could become celibate, which ultimately was the preferred choice, or to become married and mothers. You don't bathe, there's feces everywhere, there's the plague, and a man could just kill you tomorrow for rejecting him, and you want to add kids to that equation? When there's no medicine either? Pass. Hard pass. Nunneries were literal havens for these single women, because sure, you could be celibate and still live in town being a spinner or whatever, but again, you run the risk of some dude just jumping you and the courts blaming you for it and then doing something whack like cutting your nose off for it. Nunneries were female only. They kept things clean and locked up, so women could just try and have an ounce of peace in an era where existence was just to breed or feel bad about yourself. According to Halston C.S., once a girl was physically ready to consummate, aka she met Aunt Flo, she was ready for marriage. However, since puberty came earlier for females than males, they could marry at a younger age. So, for peasants who were genuinely interested in marriage out of love, something that could only be done consensually on both sides, they were eligible once they'd hit their respective puberties, and were able to wed. No parental consent required, which is the next on the list. As people lived short lives in the Middle Age period, parents of nobility often made arrangements early on, and a few months old baby could be betrothed to another few month old baby, and then raised in their respective royal nurseries until they hit that jolly old consummation age in their teens. Think Sleeping Beauty being promised to the prince in the Disney movie. Peasants and commoners, however, were able to marry as they wished, and parental consent wasn't even required. It was like this for centuries. But there's always those folks who didn't like when 2 separate religions mixed, and there's always those who tried to take advantage of the easy I do policy. So good things never last. And it didn't. When this law finally changed in England in the 18th century, the old rules still applied in Scotland, making towns just over the border such as Gretna Green a destination for English couples defying their family and wanting to marry without their consent. A brief personal story for you guys. So my mother is a traveler and decided to visit the famous Gretna Green town and wedding site, where the tradition of Gretna Green marriages still lives today. My mother was taking photos and reading history plaques when she got taken aside by her tour guide. A couple whose family wasn't supportive of their relationship relationship, just like the couples of the past had shown up and decided to marry spontaneously in the traditional way. They had chosen Gretna Green for its historical significance to their unsupported love, and they needed 2 witnesses. The tour guide could act as one witness, but they needed a second. So my mother stood as a witness for a young couple who had just traveled to the border to marry at Gretna Green alone, experiencing the same pilgrimage thousands of couples had done in history. So on the topic of witnesses, how did that get started? Up next is witness schmitness. In the Middle Ages, the household was headed by a husband and his wife was the center of the family life and economic productivity. As John Wells said in 1486, more things are necessary for a household than 4 naked thighs. And he used this retort upon hearing that his alleged betrothed, Alice Billingham, had publicly declared they were married. Instead of saying it straight, John was chastising Alice for suggesting they could legitimize their romantic relationship without the necessary social status and financial stability, not just intercourse. Alice, however, goes, nah, bro, I got the receipts, which were her witnesses to the fact that John had asked her to be his wife on the Feast of St. Valentine's that same year, which historically, yes, has always been a romance hallmark holiday, asking her for her hand so that she could be his Valentine forever. These 2 contrasting stories, however, give us a peephole into the tension between the expectation of love versus intercourse, and then the making of a good and economically fortuitous marriage in the Middle Ages. Alice says, you proposed to me with love, therefore that is our marriage basis. John says, I may have said I loved you, but I won't make a wife out of a... Well, you get it. So, while God was the ultimate witness, that's why couples could just say stuff like, be mine forever and become legally married. It's nice and all, but it was highly recommended to have witnesses to avoid uncertainty like the Alice and John situation. Because they didn't just sign your wedding doc back then, they stopped your husband from wandering off. I've done a lot of talk on the ins and outs of marriage, but how about kiss to be kissed, the medieval wedding ceremony itself? So, there was some errands to run leading up to the big day. First of all, long before the actual wedding, banns were called, which were literally 3 Sundays leading up. Someone stands outside the church and hollers that your wedding day is coming up. It's done so that people can come find out about the celebration and come along to the wedding. But also, those who had objections had the opportunity to voice them. They also put up signs on the church door with information, so if you're out just buying turnips one day and saw your husband's name and face on a poster, you could go up to the medieval lost and found and say, hey, yo, this one's mine. Wedding's off. A wedding ceremony could not be held on a Catholic holiday or on Sundays. A couple could not be married during a time of fasting. They can't be married by someone who had killed someone else. So make sure you got all those things written down to avoid. When weddings started to occur at churches, they were done at the front doors. Nobles married with big parades and elaborate garbs, while peasants sort of kicked it in whatever they had. The couple would exchange vows, usually some Jesus-y stuff, and the priests asked one last time if anybody's got any beef with these 2 getting hitched. After that, the groom presented his bride with the wedding ring, blessed by the priest, and the ring was placed on each finger of the bride before landing on the ring finger, and amen, the ring stays there. Then the procession goes into the church, a special mass began, and people prayed for the couple and their future offspring. After the mass, the priest kissed the groom on both cheeks, and finally, the groom would kiss the bride. But sometimes you can say I do and have a whole ceremony and still have to prove it. In the Middle Ages, getting married was easy for Christians living in Western Europe. According to the church, which created and enforced marriage law, couples didn't need permission of their families or priests to officiate until towards the end of the 18th century. And though the church controlled or tried to control marriage, couples didn't need to marry in a church until the 18th century. So, medieval legal records show people getting married on the road, down at the pub, at a friend's house, in bed, really anywhere. All that was required for a valid binding marriage was the consent of the 2 people involved. So, while tying the knot can take a matter of moments, proving you were married is a different story. The vast majority of marriage cases that came up before the courts were to enforce or prove that a marriage had been taken place in the first place. And marriage mix-ups bothered the clergy since, after much debate, theologians decided in the 12th century that marriage was a holy sacrament. The union of man and woman in marriage and intercourse represented the union of Christ in the church, and this was hardly symbolism to be taken lightly now. So they wrote up some laws and dished them out. The statutes issued by the English church in 1217 1215 to 1219 include warnings such as no man should place a ring of reeds or another material, vile or precious, on the young woman's hands in jest, so that he might more easily fornicate with them. Lest he thinks himself to be joking, he pledge himself to the burden of matrimony. Another thing in those statutes was hold that peace. Not your pee though, I know it sounded similar, but you can do that on the streets anywhere. It's medieval times. Beautiful. Anywho, the bonds I mentioned earlier were introduced as part of the 1215 changes to try and flush out any impediments before a marriage took place. This could be someone is already married, or she's not a virgin, or he's wanted for killing someone. There's range. Nevertheless, until the Reformation, there was no speak now or forever hold your peace. In the Middle Ages, problems discovered or revealed after marriage could have an enormous impact still. For example, Joan of Kent, who's remembered as Edward the Black Prince's wife and the mother of the future King Richard II, was married in her early teens. It was a whole Diana-level spectacle with full publicity, a church service, her new boo was an aristocrat, but after about 8 years of marriage, this marriage was overturned in the papal court and she was returned to a knight she had secretly married without her family's knowledge or approval when she was 12. Imagine that, spend 8 years with a dude only to be shipped back to some idiot I said I love you to when you were 12. If that still happened nowadays, we'd all be locked in with our first crushes. Take a minute please and soak that horrible thought in. Anyways, it's difficult to know how many medieval people married for love or found love in their arranged marriage. There was certainly a distinction between free consent to marry and having a completely free choice. Now circling back to my earlier point where I explained the wedding day, how about the wedding night? Not a moment alone is next. Alright, y'all have officially tied the knot and locked lips for the first time. You did some praying, now it's time for a meal. Pretty normal stuff that lines up with nowadays. The peasant couple celebrated with their friends and family, drinking bridal ale for this special occasion and eating a meal traditionally made up of dishes brought by the wedding guests to help feed the community. That's right y'all, like a trailer park wedding, medieval receptions were potlucks. After the reception, a peasant couple may dance and enjoy their night, but a royal couple is ushered to the chamber to consummate the marriage in bed ASAP. The priest, the clergy, parents, really whoever wanted in on the action would come into the room, kick their feet up, and have some popcorn and tell the couple, give us a show here. The bride needed to be a virgin at the time too, which had to be proven by blood being on the bed sheets. If there wasn't any, the whole wedding could be undone on the spot, which actually would be really hard for those women who don't bleed their first times. They do exist. And of course, because there isn't enough people in the room while your cherry's getting popped as is, a medieval wedding tradition allowed unmarried guests from the procession to also follow royal newlyweds into the room and take turns throwing the bride and groom stockings at them. Whoever managed to make a direct hit would presumably get married soon. Yeah, this is where the bouquet toss comes from. Then someone has to go retrieve it off the naked sweaty couple so someone else can have a throw. Truly a magical time of wedding traditions. Imposed witnesses, parental consent, church weddings. Yes, it was because of the confusing I do issue and a bunch of others I've listed, but it was also because of kidnap. So, over the last 20 years, historians have increasingly problematized consent we've heard of in the past, warning us not to project modern understanding of consent onto that medieval canon law. Today, consent is defined by what is present instead of what is absent. Yes means yes instead of no means no. In medieval times, the gap between coercion and consent was essentially a hairline. Women didn't have many legal options to deal with very persuasive or dangerous men who demanded their hand and would stop at nothing to achieve it, and consequently, the women often agreed to marry them for fear of their life. Because stopping at nothing often led to being captured, and with women being property, if said captor managed to return home and take the woman against her will before a brother, father, knight, whoever can do something about it, she becomes his property. These abductions then regularly end in marriage because of the damage of the deflowering caused to the victim's reputation. She'd never be wanted by anyone else, and so the POS who can't understand the word no wins. To delineate between consent and coercion, canon laws dropped in the 1200s stated that the degree of pressure applied on an individual could not sway a constant man or woman, meaning that neither family members, romantic partner, a stranger, anyone could exert pressure on an individual to force their consent. However, the degree to which force is interpreted and is defined by each city or community. Some communities stay stuck in old ways. And last but never the least is apparently you can be 2 into your wife. So, marriage, aside from being a means of property exchange, was also used by the church to regulate adult activities and carnal desires of the everyday person. Because any intercourse outside of marriage was a universal sin, but intercourse in marriage is only acceptable for procreation. Which means the church is trying to peddle that a good intimacy relationship was beneficial to your marriage, but neither desire nor pleasure should be involved or play a role in it, because that's physically possible. They took this serious too, man. Like, Thomas Aquinas warned that a man who slept with his wife solely for pleasure was treating her like a lady of the night, and St. Jerome stated in the 4th century that a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer. This is a sentiment which remained prevalent up until the end of the 16th century. Not only was the purpose of intercourse within marriage made abundantly clear by the church, and still is, but there were many rules and regulations pertaining to the act itself, like when the activity between the husband or wife was or wasn't permitted. That would be like a feast or fast day, Sundays, menstruation or pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth, also holidays, and holy days. This meant that on average, most married couples could legally have intercourse less than once a week. Negative 1 time a week, you guys. But at least we had champs like Albert the Great who would throw ladies the proverbial bone every now and then. He defended women's carnal desires during pregnancy, actually, in a document, claiming that the fetus stimulated desire in women. A woman never desires relations so much as she does when she is pregnant. Medicine is most needed in the time of greatest illness. Number 10 is sumptuary laws, which are the most common kind of medieval law, defined as laws made for the purpose of restraining luxury or extravagance, particularly against inordinate expenditures for apparel, food, furniture, and etc. Sumptuary laws were enacted for the purpose of regulating trade, but also regulate and reinforce social hierarchies by restricting foods, clothing, and luxury items. They did this so it was easy to identify someone's social rank and privilege in the name of good old-fashioned social discrimination and class division. Bourgeoisie subjects appearing to be as wealthy or as wealthier than ruling nobility could undermine the royals' presentations as the most powerful in the land. Why, that could cause traitors and thieves and revolts. In late medieval cities, sumptuary laws were instituted as a way for nobility to limit the conspicuous consumption of everyone, most specifically the prosperous bourgeoisie, while still making it about poor commoners enough for it to slip past them while they were busy poking fun at those below them. They missed out what the royals sneakily did above them. Cowardice tax law is number 9. Medieval knights weren't always volunteers. In fact, a grand majority of many kingdoms functioned off of what was essentially a drafting of their men into the service. So it makes sense that not everyone was as passionate about the idea of sieges or holy crusades or anything that could really get them wiped out in the name of a cause that just wasn't for them. So while it could be considered a great honor to be called to battle and you wanted to shirk your duty of obligation, you technically were able to pay a scourge, aka the cowardice tax, which originated in 1100. Essentially a get out of jail free card that you paid for with your own wage. Royalty started to lean into this new tax source, and by the 13th century it had evolved into a generalized tax on the knight's land. When the scourge tax reached 300%, the result of one king's want to force those to serve him all in a total Icarus flies too close to the sun fashion, it led to the implementation of the Magna Carta, which was forced onto royalty in the times to stunt their seemingly endless control and dictatorship. Sports banning is number 8. You've heard it in some of our other medieval videos, but we'll dive more into it now. Soccer and tennis were 2 banned sports of the medieval era. Handball, club ball, which is essentially baseball, hand fighting, which we could call boxing, I guess. This law, which was made in 1485, was due to the belief that British men were losing their legendary archery skills, and also that these sports led to the sin of gambling. Obviously, the rules didn't apply to royalty really, so tennis actually became an exclusively upper class sport for its etiquette, complex rules, and equipment requirements. Meanwhile, football, as you may already know, was absolutely brutal. There was violence leading up to deaths and serious injuries, and it was often played drunk and recklessly. In 1388, a national statute demanded that servants and laborers throughout the country stop playing football and other sports and practice archery instead, the latter being necessary for the defense of the realm. They reopened the law in 1410 to add the punishment of 6 days imprisonment for violating this rule. Even then, it was only enforced sporadically, as royals were still depicted playing this game during the time of its illegality. Unlike others, this law obviously is not still in place today. This older legislation concerning unlawful games was repealed in 1845. Number 7 says you're not for the streets if you do these things in them. There were a few smaller rules written in correlation with street behavior in medieval times. While it was okay to toss your feces just about anywhere, in 1839 a law imposed it be illegal to beat or shake any carpet or rug in the street. You can shake your doormat, however, but only before 8 AM in the morning. No carolers allowed then. It was illegal to sing songs and ballads in the street, especially if it was profane. And if you were to disturb the people by ringing doorbells or knocking on doors unexpectedly and unwantedly, you could be fined. Try enforcing that on Halloween. Meanwhile, in Scotland, it is still illegal to date to turn someone away if they knock at your door and ask to use your bathroom, no matter the time, place, age, or person. Spotted in a crowd is unfortunately number 6. Why unfortunately? Well, another fun sumptuary law, and one of the earliest ever made in Europe, governed the appearance of minorities and social groups. Enacting laws stating specific dress codes for religions such as Jews or Muslims so that they were easily to be identified from other people. In English colonies, Muslims were told to wear a crescent-shaped brooch or badge, while Jews had to wear a similar badge, as well as a ring and a yellow cone-shaped hat. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty noticeable in a crowd. Alongside people who were Muslim or Jewish, the royals regulated laws of fashion towards people with certain diseases, those not following Christianity as a religion, orphans, and women of the night. Essentially, as you can tell, these were the unwanted peoples in the kingdom. So unfortunately, as mentioned, the point of these garbs was to make these people noticeable as social outcasts, so they may face mockery and degradation they didn't deserve for just simply existing. Number 5 is the Russian beard tax. Alright, so this technically was just outside the realm of medieval times and into Middle times, but in 1698, Russian Emperor Peter the Great placed a tax on beards, hoping to force men to adopt the clean-shaven look that was common in Western Europe. Peter's goal was to shift Russia to an Eurocentric visual. His return from a 2-year escapade in Europe had him changing up the fashion trends as well, replacing their long, familiar Russian overcoats with French or Hungarian-style jackets. They were shorter in length. It meant anyone walking the streets in an old-fashioned robe was liable to have it cut short by Peter's designated fashion inspectors. The same inspectors would approach any bearded man they saw, requesting to see his beard token, a silver coin with a leafed edge, and in the center, a mustache, nose, and beard. This token was given to men who had paid their legally mandated beard tax for the year. No token provided when asked. Doesn't matter if you forgot it at home. The inspectors would cut your beard off on the spot or simply rip it out of your face. The Russian Orthodox Church, which hated Peter the Great, saw this as a downright scandal, as their teachings considered uncut facial hair a reflection of piety, seeing as man was created in the image of God, which included a beard. To shave it was a grave sin, but the church never really could stop Peter or his wily goals. This beard tax remained in place until 1772. Nowadays, these beard tokens are actually extremely rare collectibles, selling for as much as $10,000 in auctions today. Number 4 tells you don't mess with royal animals. Whether it's eating them, hunting them, or breeding them, the royals had some rules for their medieval animals. First up is how in 1332 a statute passed established the king shall have throughout the realm whales and great sturgeons taken in the sea or elsewhere within the realm. In normal English terms, what they're saying is any whales or sturgeons that were caught or washed up on crown-ruled soil, it had to first be offered to royalty before being pilfered. This law is actually still in place today, but rarely ever actualized on. However, in 2004, a fun Welsh fisherman diligently complied with the law by offering a sturgeon he had caught to the queen herself. She politely declined the offer. Interestingly enough, the provisions of this statute are expressly protected from repeal by the Wild Creatures and Forest Laws Act of 1971, as it ensures hunting these animals is minimized. Wanna offend a royal? No? Pay attention to your dog, as it's an offense to let your dog mate with any dog belonging to a royal family member. Queen Elizabeth II's corgis of modern day are included, as this law is also still valid now. There were animal laws that weren't just for royals, however. A law said that keeping a pigsty in front of your home was illegal unless it was well hidden. You also weren't allowed to be in charge or ride horses and cows if you were intoxicated, the first drunk driving regulations. And as you may know, even animals could face the judge and jury in animal court for their crimes. Number 3, we discuss how excessive food consumption led to restrictive laws on how food and drink were to be made, sold, and consumed. This is a great example of sumptuary laws from the point 10, where the royalty is irritated by blurring lines between them and the bourgeoisie. In 1309, 1109, Edward II criticized the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and dishes that the nobles were eating, emulating the lifestyle of their superiors. So Edward III, in 1336, enacts a law that would have made his daddy proud. No man of whatever rank he shall be served a meal with more than 2 courses except for certain festivals such as Christmas, on which 3 courses were allowed. Edward III said that many mischiefs caused by the many sorts of costly meats which people in this realm had used was the reason for this decision. But seeing as commoners were practically starving to death at the time, it's obvious where this law was pointed. These laws may or may not have influenced the behavior, but there was no real evidence of any actual enforcement of them. So despite this, the statute wasn't repealed until 1856, but there was no proof of it being used. Scold, and no, not what your mom does when you don't clean your room, is number 2. The word scold was used as a legal term for women who disturbed their peers or husbands' peace with quarreling, gossiping, slander, brawling, or even just talking too much. Imagine he left his socks on the floor again, you tell him to put them away, and boom, just like that, you're a scold. While being a scold wasn't a crime, it was criminally punishable, and they had quite a few imaginative and funky ways in which to do so, such as a scold's bridle, which is an iron cagelet or mouth that encases the mouth exterior and interior, ensuring that the woman's mouth opens or even her tongue moves. Metal spikes would lacerate and puncture her. Sometimes they would even add insult to injury by parading the woman around town in the bridle to face scorn, or by chaining her to a fireplace where she could inhale ash and soot and desperately try not to cough lest she gets the bridle's spikes. There was also a yoke, a type of wooden restraint that could either hold 1 or 2 people. A woman could be made to wear one alone, sent walking for hours under the disproportionate weight as a punishment, or she might be locked up with the woman she was fighting with, in which case you don't have the discomfort of the weight, but you do have the discomfort of staring at your rival's ugly mug for a while. Doing the do and when to comes in at number 1. In medieval times, there were numerous religious laws enacted that aimed to restrict the act of reproduction and the times in which it could be done. In a 7-day week, a married couple could only engage 4 of the days. Thursday and Fridays were no-no days, as people were supposed to prepare for the Holy Communion, and Sunday as well, because it was the Lord's Day. In a year itself, the 47 to 62 days of Lent, and then the 40 to 60 days of the Feast of Pentecost, relations were prohibited. For the 35 days leading up to Christmas, it was also banned. Anyways, medieval folks considered the eyes important in regards to a person's sexual appetite, so it was also encouraged not to make eye contact during banned periods with someone if you're attracted to them. That I can actually kinda get. It is a romance movie trope after all. Anyways, outside of a religious factor, abstinence during Lent ensured no babies would be born during winter time periods when food was scarce and it was harder to endure pregnancy. First up, since we've heard a decent bit about nights before, let's start with training day, or days, well, years. The joke still landed, whatever. Training for knights began around age 7, and it would take an average of 14 years before they were ready to battle. Essentially like going to middle and high school today. And like the school system, you moved up through the levels. Potential knights started as pages, who essentially acted as an assistant or servant to their assigned lord. Most of the training for pages began practicing with dull weapons, learning to master riding a horse, take part in hunts, and otherwise do menial tasks. At 14, pages would become squires, assuming they were still in good physical health and not a raging socio or psychopath. According to medieval Britain, once a page became a squire, he had to master the 7 points of agilities, which was just a really long list of sporting events. So things like shooting, fencing, wrestling, riding horses, swimming and diving, climbing, long jumping, tournaments, sports like jousting, and dancing. Okay, so that's more than 7 points of agilities, and dancing was in there, so let's just agree that medieval logic was a bit strange and their math skills were bad, and we can move on. After approximately 5 to 7 years of this higher training, if they survived and had mastered all the required skills, they'd usually be officially knighted, and that's usually at age 19 to 22. You weren't taught to have your own opinions, but people are people, and that's why sometimes a knight had to battle their conscience. As a knight, you were serving God. But what did that mean? A knight could go his whole life without having the clouds overhead opening up and God sticking his head through to yell specific directions at him out of everyone on earth to choose from. So he had to turn elsewhere for guidance. Okay, so what do we got here? Well, there's the priest, or you could ask the king, who by virtue was a direct mouthpiece of God, which by the way is super convenient to be packing when you want to do things like seduce courtiers or chop off people's heads. God said I could, haha. But this This also means a knight is always beholden to kings and that mouthpiece of his. Whether or not the orders agreed with the knight's conscience, the orders came from God and he was dedicated to that God. So what happened to knights who disobeyed that or somehow dishonored themselves? The ones who the king hits up and said, yo, I'm gonna have your wife tonight, or go execute this blind person for bumping into me, and their response was anything other than, oh yeah man, do whatever you want. Well, a king gave the knight his spurs so he could also take them away. According to noble dynasty, when a knight who did something treasonous or cowardly, correct, was just accused of doing something treasonly or cowardly because there didn't have to be proof, he got publicly stripped of knighthood in a formal ceremony, then executed. And seeing as being a knight meant that could happen at any second, X marks the plot. There must have been those knights with existentialism, the ones who laid up at night wondering if all the infidel killing and pervy chivalry and pillaging and holy calling stuff, what if it's almost but not enough to get you into heaven? Which means you could do pretty much everything right as a knight and still spend sleepless nights worrying that you wouldn't make it past the pearly gates. They were a super religious lot after all. In anticipation of solving this problem, a lot of knights, well, those who made it past their youth anyway, would often join a military order because membership usually came with a plot in a church graveyard. And seeing as they believed even people who were completely without sin could not be guaranteed a place in heaven unless they were buried in a certain kind of dirt, that's better than a pension. And no, not any dirt would do. It had to be consecrated dirt of a church graveyard. According to ancient history encyclopedia, an aging knight would sometimes even enlist at the last possible second for battle, so he could be interred beneath a lovely stone effigy in church forever without needing to do or spend any time doing boring churchy stuff. Our world loves class divide, and that's no different back then, when it sucked to be a poor knight. On that note, contrary to popular belief, not all knights were wealthy with castles and serfs and all that bougie middle-age luxury. In fact, some weren't even landowners at all, and the rank of knight was more or less something that made one a minor noble, like your auntie on city council. Though, of course, many among the knighted held higher positions in nobility separate from their knightly status. This is to do with knighthood becoming a nepo baby industry. The lowest class of these knights might even live in their lords' homes, serving more or less as bodyguards, security, occasionally law enforcement, and sometimes judges, mediating local disputes. In essence, their day-to-day was a bit of a mashup between soldier and civil law enforcement. It's like those people you met who wanted to become a cop for the fast action and the pew-pew and the speed chases, then learn its 80% paperwork and painfully slow regiment. As you might imagine, lower ranked and poorer knights love tournaments for a chance to gain prestige, practice their skills, and the chance to acquire additional wealth via prizes and ransoms and the like. So, tournaments is next on our list, because they were essentially medieval mud melees. Since knights started at not-nosed kids, it was easy to build the ideology of tournaments as fun and exciting into them, the foundation of competitiveness. In the 13th century, tournaments were particularly bloody and death was not uncommon. Initially, the games and tournaments were a little more than massive melees, usually including real sharpened weapons. There were no rules, and tensions were made intensely high because often they'd group the knights by nation or clan, then pit them against each other that way. Call whoever had that idea Taylor Swift because they wanted bad blood. That said, the general point, unlike real battle, was not to intentionally kill your opponent, but just to knock them off their horse, steal their armor and horse, and take them prisoner until the tourney is over. That being said, dull weapons weren't introduced into tournaments for hundreds of years, and they also used lances to launch each other off of horses at full speed, so realistically death is inevitable. One notable tournament took place in 1274 when King Edward I was pitted against the Count of Chalons. As the king and the count battled it out, dozens of soldiers from each side got involved and lost their lives. And these tournaments often took up whole villages. This is because they weren't much different from actual battle, so knights could take off and hide in a peasant's house from the opposing team, which was often then ransacked and burnt. Essentially, being a medieval peasant was like living in Avengers Universe New York, where at any second your whole house could be obliterated in a blink and you miss it style by a group of battling morons. Losing your life can suck, but so can losing your gear, because knights buy their own armor. The biggest barrier to entry for those who are peasants or serf turned knight was the absurdly high cost of equipment. Remember, this was centuries before governments decided to arm their troops for combat. You want to be blessed by the divine right to be controlled by me, the king, your whole life and have no freedom, property, life, money, individualism of your own, only to die stupidly in a field somewhere? Well, you also need to buy your own armor. Being a knight was a fat ripoff. Mostly you were paid in land ownership, or sometimes just by the glory of your lord. And that's because the system benefited noblemen who grew up in it, not much different from how things work nowadays. So any armor or weapons you needed had to be purchased purchased on the side. With money you were never given. It's no problem for the knights of noble birth, but other knights would have to work the land and sell goods just to earn enough. Yes, it is also a tin can, and it's one size only. Have fun rebuying pieces when weight fluctuates. One outlier though is new research and digital recreations show that knights were actually able to tumble, climb, chop wood, jump on horses, and run quite easily all in armor. So if you're scared of never being able to fit in again, never get out of it. Not like they washed much anyways. And while it can keep you safe, it can put a target on your back too. Held for ransom is next. And if you've ever watched a movie such as Gladiator, Braveheart, 300, Troy, to name a few, then you may recall that some dudes always wore special armor during battle, and some wore none. If you were rich enough or important enough, you could have the best of the best armor, made of the strongest but lightest materials to gain a defensive edge on the battlefield, all at the low price of your daddy's money. And it wasn't exclusive to any kingdom, so that means in one moment for everyone battling one another, knights realized that if they saw opponents in incredibly strong or elaborate armor, not to kill that guy, but keep him. Captured instead, a ransom could be demanded for a nobleman knight, because only well-off knights wore such good armor, so that's what you get for flashing your stack, I guess. Worst case Ontario, if the ransom doesn't work out and none of your boys are as sizes 12 as 88s in tin seam, you can melt them down for some pieces of your own. Hey, what sucked more than the medieval knight? Being married to one. Like so many of the sickest jobs in history, being a knight was exclusively reserved for the owners of a ding-a-ling. Their wives were expected to sit at home, not learning to kill people with a broadsword or pile driving her buddies into a pile of dung, their bloodlust going offensively unsatiated. Unless their husband died like a moron, that is. In that case, in a very un-Middle Ages twist, women were expected to fulfill all their husband's knightly duties. This included protecting their new lord and making sure his land didn't fall into disrepair. Only women didn't get any of the cool stuff that came with it, like respect or equality or acknowledgement by history. They got armor though, which is pretty sick. Unsurprisingly, the wives seldom waited for their husbands to get gored by a lance before getting all up in the business of running the show. He could literally drop at any time, so homegirl had to be ready. This resulted in knight wives actually being significantly more skilled and diplomatically inclined than their husbands. The duties generally expected of a knight's wife included everything from organizing the defenses of their state to arranging marriages for their servants. This was on top of being at beck and call for their husbands 24 hours a day. I wonder how many of these men really met their ends of their own accord, and how many met their end when she didn't need him anymore. It has the effect Taco Bell has on the average 21st century person. Dynastry. Dynastry is a disease caused by tainted food and drink, causing intestinal inflammation leading to excessively frequent and uncontrollable diarrhea to the point of death. So yeah, Taco Bell. Generally, no one was safe. A fact 15th century Italian polymath Girolamo Savonarola made clear when he observed that dynastry affected not only in the same house, but in the entire locale, and moving from a child of 10 or 15 to a sexagenarian. Savonarola himself came down with the disease in 1495. Now this included knights. Battling knights. On English invasion of France, King Henry II had brought a well-trained and disciplined army who were riddled with this disease. The tough-tested veterans could handle the fever and the fatigue, but the constant loss of bowel control presented a massive stinky problem on the eve of an already ominous battle. So, the English set up their position on one side of a narrow field, which lay between two forested areas. The narrow approach allowed the limited number of men-at-arms to stretch across the front, while the archers took stationary positions on the flanks angled inward with a row of protective stakes in front. Thanks to their stationary positions, the archers suffering from dynastry simply dropped their pants and shot their arrows. They also dipped their arrows in it to add insult to injury as the world's worst psychological and bio-warfare duo. I mean, can you imagine an arrow covered in that flying at you? Yeah, they won. By a lot. And topping our list is a reminder that our mental well-being is not solely a thing of the present. It's PTSD. From crime statistics and letters of pardons, historians can see that people in the Middle Ages were no more violent than we are today. And yes, they exercised it in its most extreme forms, but this violence was not through nature nor culture, rather simple direction. Whilst following their orders, those battle experiences could leave them with a very serious case of PTSD. This is backed up by a book that was actually written by a knight who lived in the first half of the 14th century. His name was Giroflée de Charny, and he was one of the most respected knights of his age. The book about the life of a knight actually includes the psychological consequences. These These symptoms ring true of PTSD. In his book, DeCharny advises knights on how to relate to the fact that they must kill people when they are at war, how to mentally endure the hardships knights face, poor sleep, hunger, emotional numbness, loneliness, and a feeling that even nature is going against them. Modern military psychology enables us to read medieval texts like these, or ones of Egypt or Greek battles and the Mongol spread, all in a new way, giving us insight into the perception of violence in the Middle Ages in the general population. In history, we've had a horrible habit of misinterpreting. Easy mistake as inflection doesn't appear on paper or stone tablets. Previously, medieval texts were read as worshipping heroes and glorifying violence, but in the light of modern military psychology, we can see the mental cost to knights and of their participation in the gruesome and extreme violent wars in the Middle Ages.